You're live.
Appreciate that. All right, Council, I'd like to call this Committee of the Whole meeting for February 2nd, 2023 to order with adoption of the agenda. Does someone want to make that motion for me, please? Councillor Cherry, seconded by Councillor Palmer. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Adoption of the minutes of the Committee of the Whole for January 12th, 2023. Someone make that motion. Councillor Palmer, seconded by Councillor Cherry. All in favor? Motion's carried. And any business arising from those minutes? Seeing none, I'm going to go right into 9A staff reports. So, Councillor Lucial, I see you're here. If you do have a question, by all means, please turn on your camera. Otherwise, if you feel you'd like to leave it off for a bit, you can. All right, going into economic development, poverty reduction strategy, and Ms. Braun, Mr. Attia, you have a presentation, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I'll share my screen now.
All right, thank you.
Can everyone see that all right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. So this presentation is about the poverty reduction strategy. It started in 2021, this update to a strategy that was written in 2012. So a fair amount of time has passed and funded by the UBCM. This is just a quick agenda of what we're going to go through, the background, some data. We're going to talk about a fair bit of data, so I'll get there quick so that we can linger on it if we need to ask questions or anything. Sorry. And a couple of early recommendations and next steps. I guess as far as we had gotten in early summer, there's a committee gathered from the community, widely representative of the social sector, the social development committee, healthcare, policing, just a really wide swath of social services. And the components of this strategy really are, a lot of it is data. A lot of this data is either outdated or doesn't exist, and we're starting to see the community change at a rate where it's becoming really useful to keep track of, not only for funding purposes when there are programs we need to apply for, but also to make decisions at the local level and to be able to inform decision makers like yourself. Looking at the sector and organizations in the social sector, again, a lot of change, a lot of different responsibilities shifting to different organizations. And then to look at data updates going into the future, and really also to talk to people who are struggling with affordability, living in poverty, and to really understand what they're going through, and maybe to pick up on strategies we might not think of just looking at data, numerical data, that is. So a lot has changed. Again, a lot of the changes that I think we're seeing now are on a bigger scale. Affordability, we're talking about housing a lot more even than then. Housing was a topic then, but I think has really come to a head. We're talking about food affordability, and we're talking about fuel affordability. We're talking about a much broader range of issues. And that means that for the community to really respond, I think it requires more of a cohesive strategy. A lot of the presentations that I gave some of yourselves during and post-COVID were about those results that social sector organizations were seeing. Their clients were entering poverty, and their problems were much bigger and harder to support than they previously had been. And again, childcare, I should add to that list of costs on the larger scale that's becoming hard to handle. Although there has been a lot of support recently for that. So starting off with the data, the median household income, which is collected through the census, but not in 2011, we can see a lot of, the income data going upward. We can see a lot of the trend going to higher median household incomes. What this doesn't tell us is where that income is going. Is it going on average up, but to different parts of the community, to different income brackets? That's kind of a question that this doesn't tell us. The importance of this is actually that when we are looked at from outside of the community, and we're a small community, sometimes the province is looking at us, sometimes the federal government is looking at us. Depending on what they look at, it can look like affordability or the incomes in the community are going up. And that's the only story you would get from this first piece of data. So it is really important when it comes to programs or different levels of government that we understand what they're seeing of our community and that we represent what is happening locally. The age demographics are pretty startling change as well. Like we can really see the increase even between 2016 and 2021 of the younger age brackets that are moving to the community, and that older age bracket that sometimes we talk about people that are selling their homes, leaving the community. That older cohort kind of tapering off, and as they might be leaving the community. I think really we need to understand that at one point we were planning a community that had more older individuals than younger, and now we've swapped completely in that regard. This is a bit more detail on the income earner tax brackets. There's a lot of numbers on this slide, but focusing on the red numbers on the side, that's the change in those income brackets. We also need to understand that this census data was collected in 2021 or 2020 when CERB was actually skewing some of the results. But really, that really affects those bottom 4 income brackets up to about 40,000, because that's the max that you could earn with CERB and work. That is about 40,000. If we look above that CERB line, that's where the story is. The number of people moving into those income brackets compared to the 5 years prior, the $100,000 and over is one of the largest increases, one of the largest single increases, along with the 40 to 50,000 and the 50 to 60,000 income brackets. All of those other groups in between, except maybe the 90 to 99,000, grew at about half the rate, but combined, that's another 300. And we also see that out-migration or the movement of people, hopefully up the income bracket, but also potentially out of the community. This doesn't really tell us which. So we ran a rental housing survey this about several months ago now, but really understanding that the data on rental housing is quite outdated. We're going off of this rental housing income data, housing index data you see on the left, and that black line is an average of $1,279 a month for rental units, about the same as a 3-bedroom. Looking to the new data, that line has moved up to $2,453. So we're at this point looking at doubling of between those two numbers. The rental housing index is, I think, appreciated that it was even low back then. So maybe a doubling is generous, but really what we need to notice is that this is far out of line with what other levels of government are looking at as well. especially considering that the CMHC does not collect data on communities under 10,000. And then again, just to also recognize that, you know, at some point, a 4-bedroom and a 2-bedroom were only about $500 of a gap. Now we're looking at thousands of dollars in terms of the difference, which makes a big difference for families. This is the three-year average of living wage calculations. We calculated the latest one several months ago as well. It's just important to recognize here that Revelstoke, as a smaller interior community, is leading most of those others following Victoria, Vancouver, when we look at that 3-year range. This one, this graph is not supposed to be, you know, a solid scientific study. It's really just telling us about the growth when we look at real estate values in these, you know, quite large resort communities, and compare them to Revelstoke over a 20-year period. But really, Canmore and Whistler have been on the trajectory of tourism growth much longer. This just tells us that over the past 20 years, Revelstoke has grown quite a bit more. And, you know, in 2002, some of you might remember a property value like that, but a lot of people have not seen an average value of a home at $82,000 in their time in Revelstoke. This is another one that we can just look at for what might be misleading about data that we see around the community, or data that is collected in the community that can't really be used as much to tell the story of where we're at. Because CERB bumped up so many incomes, the low income measure is not really indicative of where we're at right now. I'll skip that one. This is an earlier version of the presentation, but a few headlines from the Emergency Shelter 12-month update, which is the program that is you know, run with four units of emergency shelter that can be accessed through Community Connections, who's running the program, and accessed often by either hospital, police, women's shelter, or social service social workers. The total of 90 clients used the program in that 12-month period for a total of 778 nights of stay. 9 individuals accessed the program for nearly a month at a time. 3 of those individuals found housing after their stay. 6 who would have stayed that long, you know, tried but wouldn't have been able to. And since the conversation of people living in vehicles came up, 234 nights of those were people who had shared that they lived in their vehicle or did at some point. It might not have been the primary reason they were accessing. That's important to note, but a good, you know, those individuals who are forced or you know, need to live in their vehicle and it's not equipped to be outside, those individuals are the ones that are at risk when temperatures get really cold, as they did for some periods last winter. We talked about living wage, but a lot of what we want to do with this work is start to look forward and set goals for what the community can, what impact the community can have on affordability, and what we can expect from the next few years as trends accelerate. The rental vacancy rate is one of those things we're not going to expect to change. We don't know about a forestry sector transition yet, and that will affect Revelstoke. the businesses that are seeing employee shortages, we can expect them to continue on some level. We are seeing some housing come online and some additional projects come forward, so that's good to see. It's really good to see that the RMR has staff housing on their project list, because that's going to have a pronounced impact on the vacancy rate. Those cost of living increases and inflationary pressures, we've seen those continue, and importantly, they're with a number of people in Revelstoke who are approaching that line of struggle with affordability. I think that's going to be something we need to really keep aware of. And then finally, this amenity migration. Revelstoke is really an attractive place to live. So, the demand for people moving to the community is only going to continue with growth of the amenities that we're seeing, such as the proposed and under construction golf course. That's a bit of a summary, but really what we want to talk about is how are we going to maintain affordability? How, as a city or as a community, can we support affordability? And really, we need to recognize what we're up against and begin to look at what solutions are out there, and to make sure that the ones that we look at are feasible and are actually, at the scale that our organizations and our community can handle. We also have to recognize that some of these tools don't exist within the community, and that we might need to advocate to higher levels of government where it is necessary. A few of those early recommendations. Policy advocacy for resort communities. Really, this is about those outsized impacts that we see at the resort community level that are really hard to capture in a government program and often go overlooked. When another town of 8,000 people, census population, is funded for a certain amount of affordable housing from the province, that is not completely recognizing the differences between demand for affordable housing here and in that other community, for instance. That targeting support for those cost of living increases. And that looks like, looking for programs that actually can, and prioritizing programs that can support the cost of living. This is where, environmental and social and economic come together, and things like a bus, a well-supported bus program that allows families to go down to one car instead of two. That made a difference of nearly $2 in the living wage between Revelstoke and Golden this year. So that is one of those policies that the city can approach and look at as not only supporting cost of living, but also supporting employers who might not have to pay, the pay to attract or retain employees at that higher level. We also want to look at other amenity communities, other amenity migration communities, and start to make a timeline of where are we going and what trends, what kind of tipping points do we hit along that path. One of those that I think we might be starting to hear about is housing for individuals who are working higher income jobs than we would usually expect to be struggling with housing. So we're talking about, CP having built staff housing now. We're talking about police or nurses or teachers that are that's going to be harder to find a foothold in the community for those groups. And finally, that community-wide support for service providers. As as the income levels in the community do stratify to some extent, which means that there's a lot of very high incomes and individuals who may not have the option to sell their home and leave if that's what they desire to do, to go to a more affordable spot. The increased depth of need for people will increase. Okay, so sorry, I did take up some time there, but the next steps for us are really engagement. So we're working on a podcast or a radio recording that we're going to be releasing with Stoke FM. And this is going to be focused on sharing some of the lived experience from individuals in the community, but also learning from other communities and where they've been on their affordability journey to try to inform the conversations that are going on, and how, we heard as recently as this latest election, municipal. We're also looking at those organizational surveys and interviews to understand where organizations are at and what services are being offered. Continuing down that advocacy and policy development pathway to understand what levers might be available for considering affordability, and aiming to finish the strategy update in about 2 months from now. Finally, the leading out of this and into the resort social impact study will be a really important step. We're definitely acknowledging that the tourism economy and the changes that have resulted are really, they need to be considered in the big picture planning for the community. And that resort impact study is something that's been kind of lingering in the OCP for a while, and we feel its time has come. And I think Ingrid is going to speak to that a little bit more, but thanks for listening, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Great, thanks, Mr. Attia. Any questions for Taha? Okay, we're going to move on. Ms. Braun, you have something to present as well?
So I'm just going to comment on the last point that Taha's made. I'm sorry, my sound may not be great. I don't have my headphones with me today, but we will be embarking on the resort socioeconomic impact study this year. You'll see a spending package as part of our budget discussions coming forward. And that'll give us the opportunity to really measure the impact resort development has had on our residents, and to develop and identify tools we have to mitigate some of the more negative impacts. Am I doing this by thing?
Just in case you get cut off, Ms. Braun, your computer's flashing on and off here. I don't know whether your internet's unstable or what, but just so you're aware.
Okay, I'm finished.
Oh, okay, all right. Apologies. Any questions for Ms. Braun? Okay, thank you both for your input. We have no questions for you, and we look forward to updates as we move along.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to the bylaw adjudication system. So, Mr. Marcoffio, you're here. You have a bit of a presentation.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Your Worship. I have a bit of a PowerPoint here that I'm going to try and share with you guys, and then I'll walk you through it if we can. Okay. Is that working?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you for having me here today, Council and Your Worship. We're going to talk a little bit about a new type of ticketing and dispute system that is available to us on top of whatever tools that we already have. As the community has grown and developed, and over the past few years, still have the issues that bylaw enforcement have had to deal with. And we've also discovered some challenges with the growth and development. And what we found is that the tools that we have were kind of stretched or difficult to use with these new changes. And there is another type of ticketing system and dispute system included with that that helps alleviate some of those challenges, or gives us another tool to put in our toolbox. So I'll start by giving you a little bit of background on what we're doing right now. So currently there's a couple of enforcement methods that we use. The first one is a ticketing and dispute mechanism that's set aside in the community charter that allows bylaw enforcement to issue tickets. Anything a little bit more serious or offenses that require a little bit more heavy-handed if we needed to, we can move to something else called a long form information. And that's a process which requires both us and the offender to attend court. They're actually summons, they're required to attend court to answer to the charges. That would require justice of the peace or a judge, provincial court. I mentioned here that it's rarely used, meaning that we haven't used it that much here in Revelstoke. We've used it on occasion, but I would like to mention that it is a very useful tool and a very powerful tool if we needed to take on something that was giving us a lot of resistance and bringing someone into compliance, right? This long form information here would be a good tool to use, say, in the enforcement of short-term rentals, if they absolutely refuse not to comply and continue to ignore tickets and continue to operate contrary to the bylaw. So we'll keep that in mind. We propose to add an additional method for bylaw enforcement, and it is a second type of ticketing system and a dispute system, but it has some different changes and rules and methods within it that allows some benefits, not only for the municipality, but for people that end up becoming offenders and end up being ticketed through the system. It makes them, allows them to become, to dispute it a little easier, and reduces wait times for them. I'm going to move to the next slide, and I just let Cindy know I'm going to leave. There's a statistics chart here that I'm going to leave for the end here, and then I can present that, and then we can discuss that because it's just kind of a little out of place here. So what do we do now, just with the MTI system? We either receive a complaint, then on occasion on some. We may have to act upon a more serious or safety related issue that we notice. So we'll either have to issue a warning or a ticket for that. But usually when we receive a complaint, we have to prioritize the complaint and then start an investigation. Depending on what we observe with the offense, sometimes we'll issue a warning. Sometimes a verbal warning might suffice. Sometimes a written warning, being a little bit more formal, would be required. And then if required, if those first two options don't happen, we might have to issue a ticket. But not saying that we couldn't go straight to issuing a ticket, but we try and work through this process that we've laid out in our policy. So what happens when we issue a ticket? We observe the offense, we'll issue the ticket. It has to be delivered to the person, the offender, in person. If that's not possible, we'll have to deliver it to their last known address and leave it either with them or somebody else that lives there. Then the offender has an option. They could pay the ticket. They could dispute the ticket, which would mean we would end up going to a formal court process, or they could just ignore the ticket and we would eventually send it to collections to recover that fine. If an offender decides that they want to dispute the ticket, we send that ticket and some information about it to the BC Court Registry, which is located in Salmon Arm. They receive it and they will schedule dates and times and locations for that ticket to be disputed, and they'll set up a hearing and they will contact all parties involved. And then we're fixed to those dates and times that we have to show up in court. Once we do receive that notice of hearing, officers have to start preparing their evidence books for the courts. They have to provide their evidence books for the offenders, copies for themselves, and copies for the judge as well. So that is probably the largest amount of time spent in a dispute process is preparing for court. Sometimes that could take anywhere from 28 to 35 hours worth of officer time to prepare that evidence in those books for everybody. And after that, we'll attend on the date and we'll prosecute our ticket, and the offender will say their side of the story, and the judge will decide. Okay. So what are we going to do to try and cut down and streamline that process, which is not necessarily a bad process, but there are some benefits to saving us some time and money, and issues with serving tickets as well, right? So the province has created a dedicated forum for resolving local bylaw enforcement disputes, right? It's actually called the Local Government Bylaw Notice Enforcement Act, but it's most commonly referred to by almost everyone as the adjudication system. So those two terms are interchangeable here, but either one will do. So it sets up a step-by-step process, which involves a notice period, same as the NTI system that we're using now. And then it adds another step within the system that designates someone as a screening officer. It's usually a municipal employee, which allows for a formal process of meeting with the offender and discussing the issued ticket and what the offense is and what their options are. This wasn't a process that's available in the MTI process. It's just you receive a dispute, it goes to the court registry, we go and show up in court and fight the ticket there. This allows an extra step before ending up in a formal hearing, and there's a process for that, and there's certain things that can be discussed or talked about. It's not an arbitrary type of discussion. There's very objective points that have to be discussed that are laid out, that will be laid out in a bylaw if we decide that this is something we would like to do. And it's usually this step here which reduces the amount of disputes, which in turn will help reduce the amount of hours or time that an officer has to spend preparing for a hearing or court trial, right? Instead of using a justice of the peace or a provincial court judge, depending who you're sitting with that day, they use adjudicators, which are appointed by the province and the court system. They're trained and managed by the BC courts, and they're kind of an arm's length, as just like with provincial court, from the local government to keep impartiality. And they act as a judge would. They hear the cases from both parties, and then they make a decision. So with the adjudication process here, some of the other benefits that we're hoping that will help us save time and money in the long run is the process would be fairly similar. We receive a complaint, we prioritize it, we attend. Maybe we issue a verbal warning, maybe we a little bit more formal issue a written warning. It's the education process there. If not, we issue a ticket, which is called a bylaw notice or a bylaw offense notice. But this time, if there isn't a person available there, we don't have to track them down. We're able to leave that ticket behind on the vehicle, at the residence, at a work site. Living with an individual is always best, but now we have another option. We don't have to do that. With the MTI system, myself and the other officers here have sometimes spent weeks, if not months, trying to track down an offender and issue a ticket. So this really helps streamline that process and could save us a considerable amount of time. And again, the process for the offender, they could either pay it and then the system is done with. They can dispute the notice, or they could just ignore it, and that again would go to the collections agency there. There are other options other than a collection agency that's offered under the adjudication system, more formal thing, hearings, but we can get into that a little bit later. Once an offender has decided they want to dispute that and they want to have a quasi-judicial hearing, that's when it triggers the position of a screening officer here that will review the ticket, meet with the offender, discuss what was contravened in the bylaw, discuss what options are available to the offender at that time. They will also look at interview the officer that issued the ticket, and they will decide whether the ticket's able to continue on to a formal hearing with the adjudication system, or there is a possibility that the ticket could be voided. That power is given to them under the bylaws that would be created with the system here. But again, there's a very objective list of items that have to be checked off for the screening officer to be able to cancel that ticket. If they cancel the ticket, the matter's completed there. If there is a separate agreement, then sometimes you're able to have a separate agreement where it's kind of like a consent agreement that they may get a reduction in the fine for acknowledging that they've committed the offense. They sign a piece of paper saying that they committed the offense. They promise not to reoffend within the next 6 months. If they do, then there's conditions, and the fine goes back to the original amount. If the offender is not agreeable to that, if that's available to them, then the screening officer will send that ticket off to the adjudicator, and there's the office there for the adjudicators. We'll set up a hearing date and time. The date and times for that are another feature with the adjudication system that will also help save time and possibly financially more beneficial, not only for the municipality, but for the people that have been charged with a bylaw offense. In attending these quasi-judicial hearings here with an adjudicator, now the offender has options whether they wish to attend in person, whether they wish to attend over the phone, whether they wish to attend via Zoom, like we're doing now, or even just email their defense in to the adjudicator. It allows for people out of province or out of town to be able to respond and not have to return back to the community to attend court for a 20 or 30 minute hearing. So it's a benefit to them and it's a benefit to us. I think one of the best reasons for this system here is the province has allowed us to take control of the court registry, if you will. The province, the judicial system now controls the court registry. We send a ticket in, they set the dates, they set the times, and now we come and we show up, which could cause several months before having to appear in court. Sometimes we've waited up to 9 months to attend court to prosecute a simple parking ticket. So we would reduce that. So it's a benefit for us, again, a benefit for the community should somebody become an offender. It's becomes easier for us to serve tickets, saves us time there, and it allows us to have somewhat of a negotiation or a discussion on probably having some sort of consent order, which in turn may reduce the amount of times that we're actually ending up in a courtroom, which would save us time in court preparation. So that's kind of a really high general description of this system here. There are some other idiosyncrasies to it. But if you decide that this is something that the municipality should pursue, obviously we'll discuss this in the future in more details. There is a bit of a timeline that's been established for bringing this system into play, if that's what you choose. The first step would be for council here to make a resolution that they wish to be added to the roster. We wish to use this system. That resolution will be sent off to the Attorney General's court branch, and they will be added to the list, and they'll go through the procedure to add the municipality. While that's taking place, on our end here, we'll have to start preparing certain bylaws, certain policies, certain agreements, appointing screening officers, designing and printing forms for this new system, and then eventually we'll get to the point where everything's set up and we can start holding adjudication hearings here. We get to set the dates. We could hold adjudication hearings here every 3 months if we're using it that frequently. We could have them every 2 months if we find that we're quite busy. We could hold them every 6 months if we're not that busy. And financially, the best part of this system is that it's pay as you go. We're responsible for the costs of operating and paying for the adjudicator, but we would only do that when we use the system. So there's some benefits to that. The recommendations that we would hope that you think or that the system was good, that you provide a principle for the implementation of this bylaw, the adjudication system for the city, eventually through a resolution that would go to the court's services branch, and do that. And then once that happens, basically we would get to work in the back room, getting everything enabled, and then we would have to meet again and present bylaws for your approval if this is the kind of system you would think is beneficial for us. That is basically all. That's really just a rough overview of the system. There is a little bit more, but I think that kind of gives you a good overview of some of the benefits for that. I will mention one other thing though, that one of the main changes in this system is currently under the MTI system, the maximum amount fine that we could set for a ticket, if we choose, is $1,000. For the adjudication tickets, the maximum amount of fine that we're allowed to set for anything is $500. So there's a bit of a trade-off and a balance there. It is easier for us to win in court. It's based on the balance of probabilities, which is 51% allows us a win, or 51% for the offender to win as well. Whereas the MTI system is set on the more criminal standard there, beyond a reasonable doubt. So a win, we would be looking in the high 90s to win in court, which is not necessarily a problem because we've won on that standard plenty of times in the courtroom here, but it does take a higher standard to win on that. So there's some trade-offs and balances in this new system. I am going to quickly right now, I know there was some interests in the statistics that were what the stats are for bylaw enforcement here right now. So we tried to throw together here something really quickly for you, and it kind of compares the 2022 of January with 2023 with this year of January. But it's just very rough, and there's some large differences between the two, and there are quite a few variables that account for those large differences. But it kind of shows you how many warnings were issued, comparing the 2 years in January, how many tickets were issued, how many files, how many calls came in for that. On the left side there, it shows C-Click Fix, and that's, of course, as you know, the reporting mechanism that allows members of our community to report offenses to us. But it doesn't hold the entire picture here for you, because although it is a reporting mechanism, members of our community choose to report in different ways. They could phone it in, they can email us, they'll stop us in the street, they'll come into City Hall to make a complaint about an offense there. So it kind of just gives you a bit of an overview. In the future, I would be more than happy to come back with a more complete list of statistics. It's probably a fairly large discussion to have at some point, but I think if we do, I could come back with something much more comprehensive. So as far as the adjudication system here, that's all I have for you today. It kind of gives you a rough idea. And if you have any questions about that, I'll be more than happy to try and answer them.
Any questions for Mr. Mark Caulfield? So there's motions in the package. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Councilor Cherry, I was underneath plugging my computer back in.
No problem. Thanks, Your Worship. I've got a couple questions. In respects to the max fine with the MTI system versus the adjudication system, is that, for repeat offenders, would that be a max fine per day or per issue?
Yeah, thank you. Through Your Worship to Councillor Cherry, yes, that could be per day. We would have to set that term within our bylaw that would say that each day constitutes a new offense, and we would be issuing tickets every day. If there was more than one offense happening at a time, say the person was committing 3 offenses at a time, that could be 3 tickets per day for 3 different offenses, right? We could set the fines, or you can set the fines to whatever you think is reasonable. You could set it at $500, or you could set it at $100, or anywhere in between. You could even set it at $50. I kind of hope that answers a bit of the question that you were asking.
It does. I do have a couple of follow-up questions, Your Worship.
Right.
How do you plan, well, which system do you see working better for corporate offenders?
I think they would both work equally as well. I believe, though, that if you had corporate offenders, because given on the nature of the offense, if you found that it was a more serious offense, and if possible, I would probably use the MTI, because you could set fines at $1,000. So depending how accessible your corporate offenders were, if they were here, we could issue them an MTI if possible. If they weren't, now we have that option of mailing that ticket away, even though it is only half the amount. But at least we have ability to do something.
Question is, what do you see the municipal costs on a per ticket basis through the adjudication process versus the MTI? Do we have any stats on what that would look like?
The only stats that we have at the moment is through the trials periods of other municipalities using this. So what they found is that to prosecute an MTI ticket, it could cost somewhere between $2,000 to $3,000. They anticipate that the cost for an adjudication ticket would be lower than that, although they don't give a specific amount for that. I think the cost savings would come because we are not attending a formal hearing as much. So there's cost savings in officer time preparing for that. And there's also savings in the amount of hearings that we're attending, because there is another mechanism formally laid out in the legislation to have it's a bit of a stopgap with the screening officer statistically, the other municipalities found that that stopgap there allowed the offender to basically tell their side of the story, and for the municipality and the enforcing officer to explain in more clarity what the offense was under the bylaw. And that seemed to bring about resolution more times than not. And through that, you spend less time disputing. Preparing, the cost for preparing for court, the time preparing for a hearing in the adjudication wouldn't be any less than the time preparing for a formal hearing under an MTI in provincial court. It would be that you're just doing it less. And I hope that answers that question there a little bit.
Does, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Mark Caulfield? Councillor Lucio.
Thanks, Mayor Schultz. Just a couple questions. Are all tickets issued through bylaw? Are they complaint-based, or does bylaw act proactively if we're talking, for example, short-term rentals?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, through your worship to Councillor Lucio. So the majority of the work that we do is directed to be done through complaint-based, but that doesn't necessarily mean everything has been set aside. I mean, certain offenses, certain issues that you find important can be decided and directed to be more proactive. This year, this January, I could tell you for this month, the majority of tickets that were issued, probably 90% of them, were issued on a proactive base, that we were requested to undertake a parking blitz for snow removal, and that the majority of our tickets were issued through that, like 90% of them. Now, talking about short-term rentals, if we're operating on a proactive approach, then anytime that we would find an offense that needs to be enforced by ticket or other means, that would be a proactive relation undertaken. It's maybe not the easiest question to answer with short-term rentals, but I mean, if someone were to complain about a short-term rental, I guess, and we found an offense, then we can issue a ticket as well for that. I hope that doesn't make it too confusing there. And answers your question a little bit. I'll try and clean that up a bit if you'd like.
Councillor.
Thank you. No, I just have one more follow-up question. If there is somebody who is getting multiple tickets daily and they are looking to dispute them through the adjudication process, is each offense running through, or are these grouped together to all go to the adjudicator at one time?
So I can't answer 100% because we're not using the adjudication system, right? And I haven't received the training that goes along with operating in that system. But what I know from speaking with other enforcement services in other municipalities, usually they would collect a bunch of tickets and then they would send it away. Usually they have in other municipalities, they have time set out every 2 to 3 months scheduled in advance. So depending on what time frame an individual received these tickets, if it was within that time period, they would probably all go away to at once to the adjudicator to set dates for that.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
No, that's everything.
Councillor Stickhurst, then Councillor Lino.
Thank you, Your Worship. My question is, I have several questions. What is the cost of implementing this program to the city and the taxpayers?
Ms. Floyd, do you have a comment on that?
So Councillor Stapenhurst, through Your Worship, I think that we don't have any specific numbers, but like when the North Band did the 3 municipalities, they didn't tell us what the cost of implementation was, but it was around $19,000 to $20,000 a year to have the process happen.
Ms. Moore, do you have any further comment?
Through your worship, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
From my point of view and from what Cindy and I have discussed, we will be working at implementing it with the existing bylaw budget. So no significant costs to the city.
That answer your question, Councilor?
Yes, thank you. And now, so another question that I have is in regards to parking tickets. Like, are we not, like, currently we're able to write a ticket on parking and leave it on the vehicle, correct?
No,
We're not able to do that.
that's the problem, yeah.
Okay.
So when we see, so I'm gonna go to, excuse me, Councilor, I'm gonna go to Mr. Marcoffio. So when I see a ticket on a vehicle, is that just a warning ticket?
Yeah, your worship, yes, and for Councillor Stapenhurst, a lot of times probably it is a warning ticket. And then a lot of times if we're trying to get hold of somebody, we'll leave something called a love note behind, which tends to facilitate them getting hold of us there, and then we'll have a discussion, and then the ticket will be issued to the person in person at that time if required. But you'll probably see more warnings on vehicles right now than you will see actual tickets.
So if we go to the adjudication process, you can leave a ticket on the window, walk away, and that puts the onus on the offender, correct?
That is correct, your worship.
All right, thank you. I'll go back to you, Councilor. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification on that. So just to follow up on that, we are able to tow vehicles though without warning, correct?
Mr. Marcoffio, yes? Yeah, he's not.
That is correct. Yes, through your worship at the council statement host. Yes, our current traffic and highways bylaw allows us to tow vehicles if they're violating any part of the traffic and highways bylaw. They're parked illegally. We can't do that. Absolutely.
And just to follow up on that question, do we have a fairly rigorous towing policy for vehicles that are blocking snow routes?
Might have to go to, so Mr. Marcoffio, I don't know if you can answer that, but I do have Mr. Black in the room and I can look at him and go, where are we at? So Mr. Marcoffio, I'll go to you first.
No, that's a good question through your worship to council statement. We haven't towed that many vehicles this year, and it's really dependent on the snow situation. So comparably speaking to last winter, we haven't had the same frustrations due to not having quite as much snow as we did last year. But in previous years, we have had quite rigorous towing where 18 to 20 vehicles were towed in 1 month because of snow violating snow removal issues or creating problems.
That answer your question, Councilor?
To a certain degree, your worship.
Ms.
Thank
Ward,
you.
do you have comment on that?
I would just like to add something. So our towing ability also is dependent on the tow company's availability. So if they're out on the highways, then we don't have the ability to tow and clear the streets at the same time.
Yeah.
Quite often it's after the fact and then the vehicle's gone.
Okay. And then so I think what we like one of the issues that I have is that we have kind of a clear-cut solution, but we don't have the information to all the necessary information to have like a clear-cut problem. And specifically what I'm referencing is kind of a lack in the reporting. And what I would like to see before I'm able to fully support something like this is the numbers, up to 2023, back to 2019 to see all of those numbers so we can really see, where are we implementing this? Because when it comes to short-term, my understanding is that the current short-term rental policy is going to be under review for 18 months, or in 18 months, we're going to review, the current policy and see how it's working. So if this is kind of a policy that's going to be directly targeting, or one of the benefits would be short-term rentals, well, I think we'd be premature in implementing this because we're going to review how the policy is currently being effective. So that's kind of one of my hesitations. And then again, I'd like to see kind of all of the numbers for bylaws so that way we can have a full picture on, how this could be implemented, what's the benefits, what's the costs, Because right now what I'm seeing is a solution, but I'm not necessarily seeing a clear picture of the problem. You know, for example, like the towing, do we have current towing contracts with the city? You know, with outside agencies, how many contracts do we have? You know, how many vehicles are we towing? The past, you know, if we look at the past winter break, how many vehicles did we tow over the course of the past snowstorm that we just experienced? Things of that nature. So that's where I'd like to see some more information come to light.
Yes.
So Councillor Staphenhurst, I don't see a downside in moving forward if we're using the existing bylaw budget. Because whether or not the stats say this, we'll still be allowed to use both systems. So like Joe said, if there's a vehicle parked, he has to physically serve that ticket. If it's not somebody in Revelstoke, he can't physically serve that ticket. So this would help in that regard. Joe, do you have anything to add?
No, yeah. I think when it comes to the adjudication system, and I heard, you know, short-term rentals come up here a few times, and we're trying to tie the two together here a little bit here, it seems. It would be beneficial. I can tell you in our work in attempting to get a grasp on the enforcement for short-term rentals right now, one of the largest stumbling blocks that we have is that the owners of these short-term rentals that are operating illegally do not reside in the community. And there is no way for us to serve a ticket to them unless we actually travel to where they live. And that's just not realistic. Allows us to send tickets via mail to them. And that's a good start, right? We're doing something about that. Of course, the adjudication system is great for many other bylaws as well. And we have other tools in our toolbox too, beyond this, if this doesn't work, if we need to ramp things up a bit. So if we're tying the two together, yeah, this would be a great start. It would be something in our toolbox that we can start issuing. And then if we needed to move into something a little bit stronger, we could do that at a later time. But as far as that, I don't see a downside to this when we're tying those two together.
And thank you for that, Mr. Marcoffey. And what I'm seeing in communities around here, they're going through the same process we're going through now, where everyone wants to get involved in the adjudication process because the likelihood of basically having a fine go through is through that process. And I think it's a benefit to go forward. Do you have a follow-up, Councillor, before I go on?
Just real quick, so just so that we're clear, this is a fairly new system, is that correct? Fairly new implementation that's been offered by the province, or is this an old system that people are just buying into now?
Well, I don't know how old it is, but it's a system that's working because you don't have to physically be present to issue the ticket. So most people will, and so here's the thing. So you get a parking ticket in the city of Vernon. It's an adjudication system. You have to pay that ticket.
Yes.
Right. And so they're writing the ticket, there's a benefit to the community writing a ticket. Here, if Mr. Marcoffey or his colleagues write a ticket, it's basically a warning. So they've done the time, they've done the investigation, they're giving a warning. And if they want to actually serve the ticket, they have to meet the person in person. If they're lucky enough, the guy comes back to the car at the same time they're writing a ticket. Can you not just whack them with the ticket right then and there? Mr. Marcoffey?
Yes, Your Worship, you could do it then, if you're lucky enough, yes.
Mr. Black and then Ms. Floyd.
Thank you, Your Worship. I would just like to add a very small component to this discussion in that the higher rate of collection we get, the reduced cost to the city is of bylaw enforcement. So if we can offset the cost of a bylaw officer by writing tickets and actually collect, that is a net benefit to the city, in addition to making sure that, as many of you wander around downtown in the evenings, you see people park wherever they want to because they're relatively certain they're not going to get towed or ticketed. And so without this sort of enforcement, our officers are pretty much hand tied, and as a community, we can't do anything to stop that sort of activity. And so, in my opinion, this is a very strong message. It's beneficial to the community from a financial perspective, and we'll be able to capture a lot of the people coming to town that are not even in the province and getting that revenue back. Otherwise, just throw the ticket on the ground, walk away, right?
Have to keep that in mind next year. Ms. Floyd, then Ms. Moore.
Thank you, Your Worship. So the adjudication model came into effect in 2004. We didn't jump on it at that time because Revelstoke wasn't what it is now. Right now, it's great timing because the CSRD and Golden are both moving in that direction, so we could share costs of the adjudicator. And then just recently, I believe the city of Salmon Arm is looking into it. So if all four of our communities could work together, it would reduce the cost as well.
Okay. Ms. Moore.
Through your worship, I'd like to highlight for council that the current budget for MTI tickets issued each year is $25,000. This would help leverage and give us the opportunity to increase this revenue line item in the budget to offset bylaw costs.
Great, appreciate that comment. Councilor Orlando, you had a question?
Yes, Your Worship. Through the chair for Mr. Marcoffio. I was asking for some statistics and looking at MTI tickets for camping or animal control. We're not issuing tickets, for example, in 2022. And I guess my question would be for those particular offenses, would this lead to a change? And to give you background, one of the more common complaints that I get from residents is animal control related. They don't feel safe going places because they're, dogs off leash, that kind of stuff. And, in my mind, and I could be wrong, part of the solution is issuing tickets, not just warnings. And I'm wondering if this system would lead to a change if the reason we're not issuing those tickets is because, for example, it's hard to recoup through the courts or through the system.
Mr. Marcoffio, comment?
Sure. Through your worship to Councillor Orlando. This system was designed specifically for these type of offenses, animal control, parking, usually for the more minor ones, but it doesn't mean you can't use it for the more serious ones. And I hear frustration from the community. I am aware that specifically with animal control issues that there is a problem, and not using this as an excuse, even though that we've been directed to work on a complaint based with almost all complaints, there is a problem with dogs at large and people being afraid. Normally, when we issue tickets for an animal control issue, it will usually be after we've investigated an aggressive dog or a dog attack, because that's usually, those two things will stop everything else and focus our attention onto something like that. As far as getting out there on the Greenbelt and patrolling and issuing tickets out there, at this time, we just don't have that capability. We're working one officer on shift, and usually they're bogged down with the current complaints coming in. That's just the reality of the matter, and we do our best for what we can. And if there is a possibility of getting out there, but this is kind of where we're at right now.
Floyd.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I think this is probably a bigger service level discussion on whether or not you want proactive or complaint-based enforcement. That can certainly happen at a different day, but it would mean increased resources.
Councillor Orlando, Mr. Brown?
Just quickly, I support this recommendation going to the adjudication because of the frustration we all feel chasing down STR violators who live out of town. We literally are powerless right now. And this adjudication process will assist that. I get calls weekly. What are you doing about this illegal STR operating at this address? Yet the person lives in Summerland, lives in Victoria, lives in Toronto. And this is a big step toward fixing that, because it's frustrating the public as to why we're not issuing tickets and removing illegal violators on STR. Thank you.
Councilor Randall.
Your worship, just to follow up, but sort of to ask another question related to that, with animal control in 2022, there were 19 written warnings, 1 verbal warning, but 0 MTI issues. I think in order to do a written warning, often you need to be there with the person. I'm not sure what the situation is, but I'm assuming off-leash dog or something like that. I'm wondering why those aren't tickets. I'm wondering why, same thing for camping, why a warning and not a ticket.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to, if you don't mind, go back to one of our councillors had actually put a motion in. We're saying we didn't want any tickets on animals for a period of time. Was that?
No, that was on the livestock.
Oh,
So,
okay.
sorry, your
All
worship.
right, go ahead.
I think, so quite often if there's a dog running loose, the plan is, or the intent of the bylaw control officers is to educate. So this area is on leash. If the dog doesn't have a dog license, let's say, quite often they'll issue a written warning and say, if you don't have your dog license by this date, then I will come back and I'll issue you an MTI. So it's kind of that in-between stage where we really want to educate, but it's the next step before an MTI.
Do you have a follow-up, councillor?
Yeah, I guess just more of a comment, not more of a question. I feel that philosophical approach has been something that's concerned me for a long time, and it's been that, oh, we're going to issue warnings, and we're trying to get voluntary compliance. Some people just simply do not listen and will not do a thing. For example, I like to go running. I've been attacked by dogs a couple times. I go walk my dog on a leash around the green belt, and sometimes every other dog is off leash, and same people, same dog running up on you. Most of the time, not a problem. I don't have a problem with it, but I know it really concerns some community members. And plus, I've been bitten by dogs before. It's not nice. And I think as we have a fulsome discussion about these things, this is something I want to bring to the fore, and that is it time as a community, if we see people whose philosophical approach is just, I'm not going to follow the rules and who gives a darn, then do we need to respond to that appropriately? So more of a comment.
So Councilor Palmer, did you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Solis. A few questions. So just getting on the revenue. So if I'm understanding correctly, right now through the ticketing, we have a budget of about $25,000 per year. Did I hear that correctly?
Ms. Moore, correct?
Through your worship, that is correct. The budget is approximately $25,000 for MTI ticket revenue.
Thank you. And then Mayor Solis, I'm not sure who this be for, but there's been a statement that the revenues would go up. Do we know how much the revenues would go up? And just cautioning on the answer to that, because we don't know, which is fine. But if we're saying it's a certain amount, what information is that increase based on? So I don't want to hear just a number pulled out of the air.
Any comment on increase in revenue, Ms. Moore?
Through your worship, I would comment that there would be more opportunity to increase the revenue. We haven't gone through and done a detailed analysis, and I do think it would be hard to quantify until we've started implementing this new process. Although I am confident that it would allow more opportunity to increase that based off of the discussions on reduced staff timing and the ability to ticket when the person is not there.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good answer. And my point on that is we just need to be careful on why we're, how we're selling a particular program. That was a good answer. So I guess the next question I have is number of court cases currently. How often have we actually gone to court?
Ms. Floyd, any comment on that?
In the last few years? Do we have that information?
Thank you, Your Worship. I think,
Mr. Marcoffio, any comment on how many times we've gone to court?
Sure, through your worship to Councillor Palmer. So in the last 8 to 9 months, we haven't attended court at all. But previous to that, we were attending court every time court was available in Revelstoke. And each time we had 4 to 5 tickets that we were prosecuting. So I could give you a roundabout number without actually having the information in front of me here. We probably attended court 20 to 25 times.
Okay.
Ms. Floyd has
sorry,
comment.
just one quick response. Joe mentioned that we haven't gone to court, didn't go to court last year, but we did have a few things that could have gone to court that were settled outside of court. So we still had that increased cost.
Good. Yeah, so again, we're kind of modeling a little bit two sort of issues, but there's this service level question, Councillor Orlando, Councillor Stephenhurst, this idea of what's proactive, what's just complaint based. So there's confusion. I think there's been confusion by lack of policy or decisiveness from the council table, providing clarity to staff where we're going. And that was the animal enforcement stuff. There has been confusion. So to me, that's actually a bigger problem than, losing a ticket because somebody's from Alberta and they give us the finger and take off, that's whatever. But I think having that clarity, and I think that's some of the frustration in the community is really knowing what's our priorities, and so there's better clarity to staff. And maybe that's another question, because this is really on the merits of the adjudication system. I do share some hesitation with Councillor Stephenhurst on the sort of information for making the decision, but then there's a part of me that's feeling like I'm getting into the details, and I should just go with what staff is recommending on this issue. I think that's all my comments for now.
Okay. Councillor Stephenhurst.
I'd like to respectfully request that we're provided with some updated numbers, because to Mr. Evans' point, when I'm looking at the C-Clicks-Fix report from the annual reports of 2021, the numbers with the biggest were parking issues, 2,225 complaints on C-Clicks-Fix, animal control, 512 complaints, short-term rentals, 11. So if we're looking at creating policies, procedures, implementing them, let's have the accurate numbers so we can see where we need to focus on, so we can make an accurate and an informed decision. So that's all. Thank you, Your Worship.
All right, I have a comment. I'm supportive of all of the options that are here in our package, because in my conversation both with CSRD and the other communities that are going this way, this seems to be the way that actually guarantees that we get people complying with our bylaws, because now we have a bylaw that actually has a bit of teeth to it so that we can get some income back. I look at it and go, if we're going to write a ticket, let's get some income from that ticket, and trusting our staff that they're only going to issue the ticket if it deems necessary. And so you look at that, and I look at this and go, I'm recommending that we actually put these recommendations to council, and we, let our staff come back with some of the information, Mr. Stephenhurst, that you're asking for, and then we actually look at this. But let's move on this. We're going to a lot of conversation around the table, and I'm not sure whether we've got the answers that we want. So, any comments on what I just said? Councilor Chair.
Thanks, Your Worship. And for everybody around the table, I've been one of the habitual offenders for bylaw issues, as Mr. Marcoffio can attest to, both in this city and this municipality as well as plenty others. I know there's no teeth on everything. I've done everything I can to come into compliance, but there has been a ticket I've paid probably 15 years, maybe 20. I'm supportive.
So
of this
you're
motion.
willing to actually bring all those tickets to the table and pay them now? Is that what you're saying?
It's off the salary, off the salary.
That's what I heard. Yeah, that's what I heard.
I'm supportive of this, all the options that are in front of us as well. Just want to make sure we do that.
Thanks for your comment, Councilor Dunn.
I'll weigh in. I'm also supportive of this. I find that having more options on the table in terms of enforcement is never a bad thing. I'm not disagreeing with having updated information, but I don't find that one is congruent on the other, because all this does is open up options for enforcement across the board. It's not specifically tied to short-term rentals, and that seems to be coming up a lot. Would probably help in that enforcement as well, but it helps in all enforcement, and I think that's kind of the overall point that we're trying to be presented here, so I'd be very supportive of increasing the options.
Councilor Lucia, you've turned your camera on. Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Schulz. I just have one more question. When it comes to issuing these tickets through the adjudication process, if we're talking about camping tickets, would that be like one issued per day per vehicle, or if they move to a different location, are they would they be able to be ticketed twice within the same day?
Mr. Marcoffio, comment?
Through your worship to Councillor Lucio, yes, they could, because now you've committed another offense in another location. So technically, if you move to another location and you're within the window that you're not allowed to be there or be residing or camping, that would be a second offense in another location. Otherwise, if you stayed in the same location, you would receive one ticket for that day and then another ticket for the subsequent day if you were still there again 24 hours later.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I am in support of this. I think allowing bylaws to have a little bit more teeth on them, but I do have to look out for the social side and those people, and talk about the fact that that can be something that could be abused, and multiple tickets going to people that are already feeling the affordability crunch. So that would be something that I would look to adjust in our bylaws, setting those fees for camping, and if we can work in a no late fee additional cost on these bylaw infractions as well.
Okay, so I'm just going to make a across the board statement on this sort of thing. Of course, we cannot fetter our staff as to how they do their job. However, by the same token, each one of our officers does have a heart, and they look at this thing, and they're not going to be continuing to give tickets to those who couldn't afford anyway. So, and that's just kind of a blanket statement. And forgive me, Mr. Marcoffio, if I'm overstepping my bounds in that comment, but I've actually seen a heart in our bylaw officers, and understand where they're coming from and appreciate the work that they do. Councilor Palmer, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'd certainly be willing to enter into the debate if somebody puts a motion on the table.
Okay, so someone want to put the first motion on the table at the committee of the whole, recommend to council that support be, I'll actually make this motion. That support be provided in principle for the implementation of a bylaw dispute adjudication system for the city of Revelstoke. Do I have a seconder for that motion? Councilor Devlin. You want to talk about that now, Mr. Palmer?
No, I just wanted to get the debate in.
Awesome, thank you. All right. Thank you. We're moving on. I appreciate that. Any other comments on the motion on the table? Seeing none?
Yeah, I will, and I thought there might be some others. I think there's been a bit of debate there already. So I will vote in support of this, even though I have some hesitation. So it's a support principle of the implementation. So
great, and it's going to council, so you'll have a chance to talk about that in council as well. So any other comments on the motion that's on the table? Seeing none? Oh,
Sorry,
Councilor
real quick. I'm gonna make a motion to amend that to have the stats updated and provided at the net. Well, and that comes to council, so we can have an informed
Do
decision.
we have that availability to get those stats, PDQ, Mr. Marcoffio?
Through your worship to Councillor Stapenhurst. Yes, we do keep stats here, and we usually calculate them monthly. So it wouldn't be too difficult for us to come up with an annual review, and we've kept stats for several years, so we could do a comparison from 2019 or whatever the dates you were looking for. That shouldn't be too difficult at all.
Okay, Ms. Floyd, comment?
Could we actually have that as a separate recommendation instead of amending the one to support? in principle?
Certainly.
Okay, so the motion on the table as I read out, supporting this to go to council. Any other comments on that? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. So I'm going to go to Councillor Stapenhurst. You want to make a motion regarding stats now?
Yes, sir. I would like to make a motion to have the city services provide us with some updated bylaw stats. They haven't been updated since 2021 on the website. And I think that in order to create effective and efficient policies and directives, we need to have those numbers so we can look at trends and
Okay,
make
second
informed
for that
decisions.
motion.
So I'll second it. I'm just going to clarify. So the motion is that staff provide updated bylaw stats for council information.
Yeah, that's okay. All right. All right. So any comments on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Going on to item number 2, Committee of the Whole. I am going to make this motion. Committee of the Whole recommend to council that staff be supported to work with the Court Services Branch, Ministry of Attorney General to request the Lieutenant Governor and Council of the Province of British Columbia enact a regulation under Section 29 of the Local Government Bylaw Notice Enforcement Act, applying the act to the City of Ralston. Seconder for the motion, Councillor Cherry. Any further discussion on this motion? This basically enacts this motion to go forward. Again, we're recommending this to council. Any other comments from councillors? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? No, motion's carried. I am going to make motion number 3, that Committee of the Whole recommend to council that staff prepare the necessary bylaws, policies, and agreements for the implementation of the bylaw dispute adjudication system provided for the Local Government Bylaw Notice Enforcement Act for the council consideration. Seconder for that motion, Councillor Cherry. Any discussion on that motion, Councillor Palmer?
Thank you, Mayor Souls. I actually think this is a bit premature. I think we should have the information coming back from the Court Services Branch first and more information. It's probably splitting hairs a little bit, but I just wonder if we're jumping ahead and we start spending a bunch of time on bylaws and.
Comment, Ms. Floyd?
Sure, Your Worship, thank you. Councillor Palmer, so the advising court services is basically the first step. I don't know of anybody that hasn't been added to that act if we request. So we send that request off, they send us approval, and then rather than coming back to council, if you've already approved that, we would wait until that time and then we would bring all the bylaws and policies to council.
Right. Okay.
That clarify things?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other comments on the motion on the table? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? No, motion's carried. Thank you. All right. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Marcoffio. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on to fire hazard risk and vulnerability analysis. So we have a presentation. Mr. Moan, you have a presentation?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Your Worship and Council. I'm here today just to present an updated HRVA report for the purpose of just keeping council informed of what is happening with the emergency management program.
You need to share screen? Yep, you're doing it. Thanks.
There we go. It just took me a second. Yeah, so the main goal of the emergency management program is to update our emergency plans. And the first step in that was doing the hazard risk and vulnerability analysis. From here forward, I'll probably start referring to it as just the HRVA. And I'd also just like to acknowledge that the Revelstoke Area and Emergency Management Committee for their work as the working group in doing this update. We decided to use the provincially developed tool to enter our information in. So when you look at the report, the layout and the format is from the report that comes out of that provincial tool. The HRVA, one of the main purposes of the HRVA is to assess potential hazards that are relevant to our area. So we just there's a provincial list of hazards. So we just determine which ones are, are relevant to our area. And then we come up with scenarios that allow us to assess the likelihood and the consequences of those hazards. And then from that, we come up with a ranking of the risks. So that's what you're looking at on the first and second, well, the page number 4 and page number 5 here. So they're prioritized. So at the top, we have rail incidents, for example, and then you can see the likelihood and the consequence as well as the risk level. Second page, more of the same. It goes down to number 33. So we have 1 to 33 hazards included in the HRVA. The consequences, as I mentioned, we looked at the likelihood and the consequences. Consequences look at 11 different categories. And what this table is just showing is just the accumulated total of how we set rankings to each of those categories. And then as we're going through it, we also keep in mind our critical assets and infrastructure, how those are affected by the scenarios that we've determined for the hazards, as well as the vulnerabilities that we can find within our area. And so what that brings us to is the risk reduction measures. So this is kind of the output of the report. And so we look at what are the current risk reduction measures. So what we're looking for here is how are we becoming, where is our resiliency and how do we become more resilient? So that would be the future risk reduction measures. So we didn't list all of the hazards here. I believe we just listed the top 13 with the current risk reduction measures. And then future risk reduction measures, you'll see that some of them are left blank. Some of them, the working group just didn't have any recommendations above and beyond the experts in that field. So rail incidents, for example, CP, they're the experts and they have a fairly complex and thorough risk reduction measures that are currently in place. So that's why you may not see future risk reduction measures in the right-hand column. Towards the top, there's several risk reduction measures that would benefit several of these hazards. And so rather than list them into each hazard, I just listed them at the top. And it's kind of where, kind of sets out where we're going next with this. And so some of those future risk reduction measures would be to continue with the emergency response plan update. That would lead into an evacuation plan update, followed by communications plan, as well as business continuity plan. And then also training and improved or increased training, I should say, and a number of staff that are trained for emergencies and to fill a role in the EOC as part of it. We put a climate change review in here just because with the provincial tool, climate change is a big part of it and they integrated into it. And we just didn't feel we had the expertise on our working group to kind of weigh in on the climate change. And so we would like to have somebody whose field it is to review our HRVA in the future. And in a nutshell, that's just my discussion on the HRVA report. I just wanted to run it by you, information, and let you know what our plans were moving forward. So thank you, and that's what I have to report on.
Great, thanks, Mr. Nolan. I really appreciate this report. That, you know, kind of from looking at it from the board perspective when we're dealing with Revelstoke Area Emergency Management Plan, having a report and knowing what's going on and how you're dealing with things is important. It's good for the public to see, it's good for council to see, and I really do appreciate the time that you spent putting that together. So any comments or questions from councillors? Councillor Staphenhurst.
Quick question for you, Mr. Mullen. The HRVA, when was that conducted? Just out of curiosity.
Councillor Staphenhurst, through your worship, the previous one was in 2006, 2007.
Just sorry, just curious, due to the fact that, like public disturbance was rated as a unlikely, and just current events in Ottawa, and then what we've seen down in the States, and then was what just happened in Prince George's, like we have these dynamic social situations that, they can change in the blink of a minute. So just curious from a personal perspective. So thank you.
Councilor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Souza. Hopefully I didn't miss the introduction, but on the decision of if something's low or medium or high, is that, how is that decided? Was it, how is that level decided? I guess that's the question.
Okay. Mr. Moe.
Councilor Palmer, through your worship. If we're talking about the risk level, we would look at we came up with a scenario for each hazard, and that scenario, by coming up with it strictly for our area, which not on a larger scale, we wanted to look at Revelstoke and area specific, and so we've come up with a scenario. So it is fairly subjective, and so it is fluid. We can definitely, if something happens, these rankings may change somewhat, but the working group would go through and look at the scenario and determine what was the historical and what do we think the future potential is of that hazard taking place. And then we would determine, going through the 11 different consequent categories, like if we were looking at fatalities, injuries, displacement, psychosocial, one of those 11, and we would just rank those. And then by the time when you get your likelihood and your consequence rating, then the program would just combine those together and come up with a risk rating. And then it automatically auto-populates based on priority.
So basically it's subjective. It's interesting because when I was going through this, reading it in advance, I put a bunch of question marks, and I guess my subjective assessment varied on some of them, and then exactly what that means. I'll mention a couple. So it's not a criticism at all. It's just another subjective, I guess, pair of eyes. So the rail incident, if it was me, I would say that's a high consequence, and that's based on the history across Canada and events and some of the risk that we've had locally here in Revelstoke, including runaway cars and that kind of thing. The confidence with the rail industry looking after that's profit oriented, I don't have the same kind of confidence that maybe others do. The second one was on, so these are just a couple examples, the human disease, and just again looking at the what's happened in the last 3 years. Again, I would have put that a high likelihood. So it's more just sort of a comment and sort of thinking, well, how does the public look at how we've rated different things, and what the implications. So that's just a sort of a general observation.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make a comment on that, Your Worship?
Yes, by all means, please.
Yeah, so Councillor Palmer, through Your Worship, I agree with you. Some of the consequences do seem low, and we as a group would probably rate them higher if it was up to us just to say low, medium, or high. The way the program is set up with those 11 consequences, it's ranked from 0 to 4. So fatalities, if you had, I can't remember what it is, but if you had 10 fatalities or more, you would rank a 4. And if you only had 1, you might only rank a 1. And so when you look at these 11 different consequence categories, it adds up all of those quantified ratings, and it gives you a total. And so even though you're looking at something that may create 50 fatalities and it may do property damage, if the other consequences didn't have a higher rating, it would automatically dump it into a medium consequence. So even though it should be high, it is kind of rated against each one of its other hazards. So even though it's moderate, it's still higher than the other ones that are low, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, a little bit. It's interesting that we have no reds. Visually, there's no reds on this chart. So it's and I almost wonder, well, is it possible to have a red? But that's good. That explanation is good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for that. Anyway, thanks for that. I can't sit up like we're explanation. Wow, I'm not working well today. Let's be lack of sleep. Thank you, Mr. Moan. Appreciate your input. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, we're going to move on to zoning bylaw discussion. I'd like to take a 5-minute recess, a final break. So, Ms. Rousseau, if you could put up the notification, we're just going to take a quick break. Mr. Simon, if you don't mind waiting for a couple minutes, and we'll do that. So if any of you need to reload on coffee or water, some of us are old and need to use the washroom.
Just because your toast is now. Top left.
Okay, Ms. Rousseau, we're ready to go. Mr. Simon, we have zoning bylaw, and I understand you can do this in 4.5 minutes.
I say through your worship, it's very good that you chose to opt for a little break, because you guys probably haven't noticed, but I do enjoy talking, so I'll certainly try my best to keep it tight today.
Not a bad singer either.
At the end, perhaps depends on the outcome. So.
Okay, well, if you're quick, we'll let you sing. If you're gonna take too bloody long, then hell no.
I'll skip through the whole thing then. Okay. So thank you very much, your worship and council. We do have a presentation for you guys today, and we're going to start off. We're looking at quite a big project, a comprehensive rewrite of the zoning bylaw, which has been overdue for some time. So I'm going to talk for a little bit. I'll keep it as tight as possible on the background and how staff proposed to ultimately tackle this rewrite. It's just a big undertaking. But then we're going to move into what we hope will be a robust discussion with council at this committee of the whole meeting today, so that we can get some preliminary direction at the onset of this process before we start embarking on actually doing the rewrite. So really high level, just to start, what is a zoning bylaw? I think it's important to start with this point. So it's regulated under the Local Government Act, and in a nutshell, zoning bylaw is going to establish different zones for different properties throughout the city. It's going to give regulations on what the size and dimensions of lots can be, and it's going to tell you what density you can develop at, how tall you can build to, what your setbacks are, and really importantly, what uses you're allowed to undertake within your zone. What does the current zoning bylaw contain? So right now, the current zoning bylaw is structured in the following way. Some pretty basic, generic, legislatively required things about, the purpose of the bylaw, enabling legislation, basic provisions, supplementary regulations, really, really important. This is where you get things that may be permitted throughout the entire city, accessory dwelling units, garden suites, carriage suites, things of that nature. This is where you would find those regulations that a use that's allowed in multiple residential areas, instead of putting the regulations within a specific zone where you got to repeat them over and over again, you put them into a section that's called supplementary regulations. Then you start getting into the actual zones, R1 zone, R2 zone, etc. Here's the uses you can undertake. Here's the regulations you got to abide by. We got some parking and loading regulations. And then lastly, some provisions when it comes to administration and enforcement of the bylaw and definitions. I don't want to undersell definitions. They're the boring part that everyone thinks, but they are the heart of any zoning bylaw. So it's not anticipated that with this rewrite, we're going to deviate significantly from this structure. It's a very easy to follow structure. However, the content, more or less, a lot of it is going to be pulled right out and replaced with new content that's far superior to what we have right now. So really important distinction here. We just did this OCP, and when you go into the OCP, you're going to see this map that the planners love, the land use designation map. A lot of different eye-catching colors that are assigned to different properties within the city. And it's really important to understand the difference between land use designations in the OCP and zones that are applicable to a subject property. An OCP land use designation, the easiest way I can describe it is it sets the stage for what could be developed on a property in the future at a high level sense. This is where we get to where should commercial be located? Where should residential of varying densities? Where should industrial? So whenever someone comes into the city and they want to talk with one of the planning staff and they say, I want to rezone my property, the first thing that staff here do is we look at the land use designation map in the OCP and we say, what does the OCP identify at a high level, keep in mind, is a suitable type of development for this property? So this just shows you at a high level. On the left side is the current land use designation map in the city, and on the right side is the zoning map. The zones are going to give you the firm on the ground rules what you can do. The land use designations, again, if someone wants to rezone their property, it's going to tell you at a high level, yeah, this property is suitable for low density residential, suitable for commercial, suitable for industrial. So big question, why do we need a rewrite? We did do a comprehensive initial review of the zoning bylaw that was adopted in January 2022. This first phase included regulations for carriage and garden suites, which was some great low-hanging fruit to try and start supporting additional housing development and gentle densification within the city. In addition to that, secondary suites within duplexes and row homes. We're one of the few municipalities in BC, especially small municipalities, that have actually taken advantage of those changes to the BC Building Code. So certainly a lot of kudos to council for supporting that previously. We expanded the provision for density bonusing regulations, which has spurred some development of the missing middle housing. We see more row house developments being proposed utilizing those density bonusing provisions, greater allowances for food production and greenhouses, provisions for parking bonuses when you are within walkable areas, and then just overall a general cleanup. We had so much nitty-gritty implementation stuff day to day that caused challenges. How we calculate the heights of buildings, very, very cumbersome. So we did a really solid cleanup with that initial phase. However, we have a new OCP, we have a housing action plan, we have other master planning documents that our community economic development group's been working on, our engineering group's been working on. So it's time now to really start delving into, we got to start peeling out all these existing zones, peeling out the supplementary regulations, and replacing them with new ones that align with these master planning documents. So where do we even start? It's a complex undertaking. There's so many different ways that you can start to tackle a comprehensive rewrite of a zoning bylaw. A lot of planners are going to have different views on how we ultimately tackle this. One of the biggest things that we want to do is we want to do a lot of this work in-house. The staff here have been implementing and administering and interpreting the bylaw and have been working with the community and the partners that use the zoning bylaw so frequently. And we have a real solid understanding of some of the challenges. And we also have a real solid understanding because we did the vast majority of OCP drafting in-house as well with the support of internal city departments. So we understand the guiding direction in our master planning documents, and we understand the current gaps and flaws within the zoning bylaw. So we have prepared a project management plan. And what I'm going to do is kind of go through the key highlights of that project management plan right now. It is anticipated, and I know, and we can have this discussion as we move into it, the idea of a track changes document. We are going to be seeing wholesale changes. And when you really take a step back and think about what we're doing, we are peeling out every single zone that exists within the zoning bylaw. Some of them might be slightly modified, some of them might be consolidated, some of them might be eliminated altogether. And we're going to create new zones as well. Some of them will be applied new zones. So that is a big undertaking. And to have a track changes version of a bylaw amendment to come forward, we are going to very quickly realize that that becomes a very messy document. So it is anticipated that this will be a repeal and replace bylaw. So general roadmap to how we actually tackle this. So we're going to review all the existing zones, including updates, consolidation, drafting of new zones as required, review all the uses within the zoning bylaw, look at what ones can be removed, which ones can be consolidated. Anyone who's experienced working with the zoning bylaw probably looks through the 13 or 14 commercial zones we have and asks, why does this zone permit this use, but this zone doesn't permit this use? And that actually starts to inhibit, creative economic development. And it starts to really drag out the process of how long it takes to get approval to do things like zoning bylaw text amendments to add minor uses in. An example we had, a couple of years ago, I remember a text amendment to the light industrial zone to allow cafe as a secondary use, even though there were other comparable uses in that zone. So we'll be cleaning that up to allow flexibility. We're going to review, what new zone should be applied for all properties within the city. This will perhaps be one of the greatest undertakings because we're essentially, again, peeling out all those zones as they currently exist, replacing them with new or amended or consolidated zones. And you have to go through and you have to apply a new zone to every single property in the city. That is a very big undertaking, but it is so necessary right now. And it's something that has never been done in a comprehensive manner at the city. We're going to be reviewing all definitions for clarity, consistency, and inconsistencies, and add new definitions where required. We're going to draft new and updated supplementary zoning regulations. Remember those accessory dwelling unit regulations I previously mentioned? Those are the supplementary regulations. And then critically important as well, and taking advice from documents like the OCP and the soon to hopefully be adopted transportation master plan, look at updating our parking and loading regulations. So this is a general overview of how we anticipate the timing to work. Now, this is a bit in flux depending on direction received today, as well as depending on how the scope of work actually does unfold, because again, we do want to do the majority of this work in-house. So phase one, general project management, background review, and some preliminary high-level mapping that we'll be doing internally. That's going to be completed by about the end of March. And then a really key phase is phase two. So this is where we're going to be looking at all the new zones, all the uses as they're contained within each zone, and a review of definitions. And we'd be creating a new draft zoning map at that time. So that is a lot of head down work within the planning department to get that completed. And we're anticipating between March and September is when that work will happen. Phase three would include a review of the supplementary regulations, parking and loading, September to January. And then once we start getting into January, that's when we're going to put all the pieces together, have a full draft bylaw, full public launch, and initial council consideration. So you can see that would take us to about June 2024. We do anticipate this to be approximately an 18-month process. It might get upwards of the 24-month process, depending on the feedback that we get when we go out to stakeholder engagement. But we are hoping to bring something to council by spring or summer of next year. So public engagement. We did a lot of engagement, and we were really on what you see here in the diagram. This is from the International Association of Public Participation. There's basically 5 ways to consult with the community: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, empower. As you go further on the right end of the spectrum, the level of engagement with the community increases. When we were doing the OCP and Housing Action Plan, and especially for the OCP, we were really on the collaborate end of the spectrum, which is very appropriate for an official community plan. The OCP is supposed to be the main guiding document that we get the most robust community engagement from. And if you recall, it was over 1,100 hours just between the focus group and policy teams on the OCP that dedicated their time to help inform the outcome of the document. Zoning bylaws, they're not vision documents. They are technical documents with very specific regulations of how on-the-ground development occurs. So engagement with the community, as we're proposing, is more on the consult and involve end of the spectrum. And I'll get into a little bit more detail on what that would actually include. But one of the key components of this is we're proposing to utilize the existing Advisory Planning Commission as a technical review committee, almost in a similar capacity for how we use the focus group for the OCP review, but a little bit more scaled down and targeted specifically to work within the existing APC format. So here's a high-level overview of tentative engagement strategies and targets. So Committee of the Whole, which we're doing today as the initial discussion, we would anticipate a project launch in March of this year, and then initial APC discussion in March as well. Phase 2, create new zones in a zoning map. APC in April and September, and then Committee of the Whole in September. There would likely be some APC meetings in between there. And the key thing here is we have 2 major public launch dates. We want to make sure that this isn't going to be a case where we ask the public to come out, give some feedback, staff go huddle down, do a bunch of work, and then bring back a draft bylaw and say, come to some open houses. You know, here's the whole bylaw, 150 pages. Let us know your feedback, take a survey. That's really challenging. So we really got to consider, what does the public really want to know when we're doing a zoning bylaw? And one of the key things is, what's my current zone? What are you proposing to change it to? And what are the zones around me going to be? So we proposed 2 key launches, one of them being in about September, and we would anticipate the public review process going until December. We want to allow substantial time here. And that would be when we release all of the new draft zones along with the draft zoning map. So if anyone has any issues, anyone wants to come in and have a chat with staff, we propose utilizing, they're called coffee chats. So discussions that are semi-structured, where the public would be able to come in and they would be able to talk with us about, well, what does this change mean for me? What does it mean for my neighborhood and my community? And so that would be the first major public release. And then the second, once we get all that feedback and we compile it into the final draft bylaw, we want to do a full public launch where, to make sure everyone's aware, you know, we've contemplated this idea of a community-wide mail-out in advance of doing open houses, so that members of the public are very well informed that a new bylaw has been crafted and that there is an opportunity to come out and give feedback well in advance of a public hearing. Again, APC and Committee of the Whole in April 2024. We would anticipate holding another round of coffee chats. Sometimes individuals aren't comfortable coming to a big open house and speaking about their concerns. So we want to make sure that we're cognizant of that and that we allow additional opportunities through these more one-on-one group chat scenarios. And if all that goes well, we do anticipate council consideration in June. But again, depending on the feedback, that certainly could get pushed back or pulled forward as to how smooth the process ultimately goes. And throughout the process, you're going to see social media blasts, updates on Talk Revelstoke, Q&A functions on Talk Revelstoke, other communication tools such as the mayor's update, YouTube videos, advertisements on key dates. This will be happening, and certainly if additional Committee of the Whole meetings for discussion are needed, we can always bring the bylaw and the work that's done to date forward for Committee of the Whole discussion. Budget for the project, where budget request of $97,000 between 2023 and 2024 is proposed. So we had some carry forward because there was money dedicated in the budget in 2021, 2022. We didn't do any zoning bylaw work in 2022 because we were focused on the OCP, Housing Action Plan, short-term rental, and the initial phase of the zoning bylaw in January. So we have that money that's carrying forward from 2022 into 2023. We have $20,000 in grant funding through the DAPR program, the Development Approval Review Process. And then we have requested an additional $25,000 in 2024. And so you will see that coming forward in the budget. Again, a large portion of the work is completed utilizing in-house resources. So that's enough of me talking. So there's 5 key points that we want to generate some discussion with council today, just to give some initial thought towards some of the key things that we're going to have to grapple with. And we want to almost kind of take the temperature with council to see where your guys' collective head is at with respect to some of these key items. So level of public engagement, pre-zoning properties, overall density provisions, parking levels, and then animal agriculture. So with respect to the level of engagement, as stated, zoning bylaws are a lot more technical than OCPs. So engagement needs to reflect that. We want to make sure that the engagement is accessible for the community and that they understand what they're being requested to provide comment on. So the OCP and Housing Action Plan, again, we are working from the direction that's provided in these master documents. There's 19 specific action items. They're included as attachment 1 in the package with you today that are related to zoning bylaw updates. And having done these projects before, you know, my experience is the vast majority of residents, again, what are they concerned with? What is my current zoning? What is it changing to? And what's the zoning of the properties around me changing? Certainly, some members of the public, especially those within the building and development community, are going to want to delve into some of the nitty-gritty details of the new zones. They're going to want to delve into parking regulations. But the average member of the public, they want to understand what their current development rights are and whether or not they're being changed, and whether or not their next door neighbor is going to be eligible to build a big condo next to them without having to go through a public hearing process. So again, kind of touched upon the coffee chats. We have many months that are dedicated to having one-on-one conversations or group conversations with members of the public to make sure that their concerns are incorporated into the final bylaw. So that will be one of the key ways to do targeted stakeholder engagement with this process. So this is a repeat slide of what we had provided previously when I was discussing how we were going to be engaging the community, utilizing APC as a technical review committee, community-wide mail out at the end of the process, a couple options for coffee chats, and then some open houses once we have the bylaw fully drafted. So through your worship, I would pass it over to council now, just to get a general sense as to whether or not council feels that this is an appropriate level of engagement, if it's too much engagement, or if it's too little engagement.
All right, thank you, Mr. Simon. You did well in that presentation. Appreciate it. Comments from council. Who wants to start? Councilor Palmer.
I'll just start on the engagement piece. I'm wondering, Mayor Souls, and perhaps to Councillor Orlando, on the engagement piece, is there something that the communications task force maybe should just take a quick look, just communications process?
Comment, Councillor?
Yeah,
I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, we have a meeting tomorrow. We're looking at some short-term and long-term things, but in terms of timeline, most of what we're looking to implement, including the staff hire and communications plan, I mean, it's going to take like a year to get that in place. So we have, you know, in the shorter term, we're just trying to bring back the email newsletter that the city was doing, and hopefully could continually build up for that. But given the timeline, I don't know if there's going to be a huge impact in terms of numbers, but I think the email newsletter, which currently has about 300 subscribers, it hasn't been used since 2019, will be a benefit to some extent. And if we can be aggressive in building that up, that will have an impact. But yeah, the more the merrier. I mean, to boil it all down, it comes down to data. You know, like how many numbers are you hitting? So when we talk about those various methods, it's all about looking at what the actual, measuring the actual effect of it is. So I mean, that should be the answer. And like, you know, we reached X number of people.
So
further comment?
Yeah, so then just I'm going to put it in different words. So what I'm hearing, and I think I agree, is that the Communications Task Force is more of an umbrella thing. This is getting into more nitty-gritty detail and maybe isn't really necessarily in the scope, although what we're doing at the Communications Task Force will help some of the data-driven processes for Mr. Simon and his team.
Yeah, at the end of the day, sorry, just to answer this, at the end of the day, it's about having a communications person who can show you what they achieved with their data and how they, what targets they managed to achieve, and be objectively report that. You know, there's a lot of methods prescribed there. Those are all great, but at the end of the day, they need to have some more control, and that's on, you know, being able to tell, like, this is how many people we reached through various methods.
So Mayor Souls, my second item is a question to Mr. Simon. Actually, I have a couple of questions. So your timeline, especially on the far end, that June target date, it to me feels a little tight and ambitious. And so maybe just take a look at that, because I'd rather that we had make sure that we have, that we don't get into the thing, okay, we're extending and we have to backtrack anticipating, because there was a lot happening in April, May, there's a lot of stuff there. And then June happens and suddenly we're facing summer and that kind of thing. So there's not even wiggle room for 1 month in there, because suddenly we're into the summer months. So I think that's mostly a comment, I guess. Yeah.
And I like that, because, you know, I was going to say, Mr. Simon, how can you tighten this up?
And I'm saying, yeah. Well, it's a big.
Thanks for that comment.
It's a big.
It's a big process. It's a big undertaking.
Actually, I liked his this quoting Mr. Simon, said the greatest undertaking, and I thought, okay, that's an interesting statement that you made. I can't remember the exact context, but it's the greatest in that it's going to take a lot of time.
Yeah.
But it's also, there's all this real great stuff that's going to come out of this that is really tangible in the future. The other question I have, so on your resources that you have available, so again, this is, a greatest undertaking. We're also, I think you've been working on tools on the planning processes for serving the community in a better way. And I guess you're confident that you can keep moving ahead on some of those pieces, because you got a lot of work, a lot of things to sort of fix on the functional day-to-day operations. That takes a lot of energy as well, and so this is another big project. So again, on the timelines, yeah.
Mr. Simon.
Through your worship, I wasn't too sure if you're looking for a response on that, but certainly noted here that staff can make sure that it might be better to provide kind of a range of anticipated dates for some of these key milestones. And the whole goal here is, you know, when we are developing our project management plan and our communication strategy, transparency is one of the, you know, key guiding visions in that communications plan. And we want to, when we do a public launch, We want the community to understand at the beginning of the process, here is the targeted timelines for key engagement milestones. And if there are any changes, everything will be updated to reflect those changes, and there will be rationale as to why things could be potentially delayed if it takes longer to do X, Y, and Z task. And with respect to the other work that's going on within the planning department, we certainly do anticipate a very busy 2023 up until about the end of Q2, Q3. So they will be a busy first several months, but we are confident that we can keep everything managed.
And then finally, Mayor Souls, I guess it's just a couple of comments why I'm actually excited about this. And so one on our park, one of the big problems with our zoning is we don't have a zone that protects natural land from any kind of development. That's a real important thing when we're looking after our natural amenities within our community. The other is, again, borrowing from our CAO, some information on eco-density, creating opportunities for higher density so that we're not having continuation of urban sprawl and big. So I think that's sort of a philosophy that's set there. Along with that is reduce setbacks in residential areas so that we can have better infill, allow smaller lots, whether that's, small subdivisions and 2-lot subdivisions, that kind of thing. And then the other is, where with the changes potentially from the province on the idea of, 3 dwelling units within R1 zones and where that might go. And I don't think we want to drill into that discussion right now, but those are some really big things within the zoning that I think are really key for making changes in the future.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor Souls.
Mr. Simon, you have comment, and then I would like to make comment.
Through your worship, yeah, I just want to note there actually is a question in the later portion of the presentation. That's one of the things looking at density. So we do have some pointing questions for council today with respect to that. So I just want to, the key right now, and again, there's still a few more slides to get through, but it's just getting a general sense from council with, the level of engagement as is proposed in the staff report and in the presentation that I've elaborated on. Is council generally satisfied with that level of engagement, understanding that if there's a need to engage greater, we can certainly do that. Or if things go a little bit smoother and there's a way to expedite review of some of these items, we can also do that. But just to understand if council has a general comfort level with the engagement strategy as we've proposed it. And again, key items, utilizing APC as a technical review committee, a couple key public launch dates, and allowances for coffee chats.
So I'm going to answer your question so that we can move on, Mr. Simon. I believe what you've got here is sufficient. You're asking, is the proposed level of engagement sufficient? Bearing in mind as we bring a communications person on board at some point and the ability to supplement your communications out in addition to what you've got here, bearing in mind staffing and availability and new ways of communicating. If we can look at that and say, hey, here's an idea, this will work. And as I go back to our communications task force and the data and how things are driven, if we have the ability to say to you, here's some options that may assist, or we have some ideas that may assist you to get more information out to more people, I think you're working in the right direction. And as long as council can basically say, hey, we've got a new way or something in addition to what you're doing, if this will work with you without causing any grief to your department, I think we're on the right track. So does that answer your question? And then I'm going to go to council. Councilor Cherry, you have your hand up.
Thanks, your worship. Through your worship to Mr. Simon. I do like the APC coming in as a technical review. I'm wondering though if there'll be information sessions for the public as well on top of what's written here, and some stakeholder or industry consultation on top of this as well.
Mr. Simon.
Through your worship to Councillor Cherry, yes, we have certainly discussed the idea and we floated it with some members that are in the development industry and some designers in town to see if they'd be willing to do some testing once we have new zones drafted to make sure that it works within, the unique circumstance of Revelstoke, where we do have some unique lots within town. So we have certainly discussed that, and a lot of that, the reason why you're not seeing it specifically embedded in there is because it is highly dependent on their capacity and their willingness to engage. And with respect to additional public engagement sessions, we have open houses that would be planned once there is a draft bylaw release. And those coffee chats really are intended to either be, we can have landowners come in one-on-one. We can have a whole block of landowners come in that are concerned about the zoning that's proposed on their specific neighborhood. So that really is intended to provide ample opportunity for members of the public to come. If they want to give requests for changes that they want to see done, we can log that. Or if they just want to be educated on what the nature of the bylaw is, what the changes are as contemplated, then the coffee chats can serve that function as well.
Follow up, Councillor?
Yeah, I guess my fear is that we're gonna have some individuals in the community hijack this without having the proper information and the knowledge and background of what they're actually looking at, and use it to I don't even know what the word would be, just be extremely combative, as we've seen just about everything we've brought forward in the previous years as council.
Yeah, and so what you're saying is I can't come forward saying I want to raise goats on my property, put in my logging mill, and I still want to only pay residential taxes?
Yeah, stuff like that. Just people that don't like any change at all in our community that seem to hijack any issue and make it bigger than it is or outside the boundaries. And I think an info session, even more than coffee chats, might help.
And I think if we give the ability to the staff and input from council saying, can you do a public information session at this point? Is there that flexibility, Mr. Simon, for your department?
Through your worship, yes, that is certainly something that we could do. So what I'm hearing is maybe a little bit more focus on education at the beginning of the process, rather than relying upon kind of individual meetings and then broader public open houses at the end, so that people are primed a little bit to understand more about what a zoning bylaw is and why we're doing this at the onset, rather than waiting a little bit longer to have that conversation.
That's exactly, Mr. Cherry's nodding and giving thumbs up to that. Any further comment, Council?
No, that's it for me. I'm pretty supportive of this.
Okay, Councilor Palmer?
Yeah, thank you. And sorry for jumping ahead to the next up. I just tried to keep it succinct. And
thanks.
I did have a comment further to the APC and just this discussion we had on the communications part. So yeah, when you talked about having the APC as the technical review committee, is an interesting sort of academic thing that went in my mind as to, okay, well, what does that look like? And are we shutting out an opportunity for more engagement? And notwithstanding any sort of naysayers on improvements, but is there an opportunity? These are just sort of general questions. Is there an opportunity, say, for in the building community that can understand, the benefits of smaller lots and that kind of thing, allowing, because there will be some pushback on some of those things if we get to that. And so that I guess I'm kind of echoing a little bit on the education, but also on that early opportunity, because if we wait until 2024 to say, well, here's another opportunity, then, that was a missed opportunity earlier on. So I'm not sure that I'm really saying much other than maybe there's an opportunity without getting it into a long drawn out public process. These are people that are actually interested in no zoning and can provide some real good input on the earlier stage. APC for sure has that ability, but there's going to be other people in the community as well that have that.
Comments, Mr. Simon?
So through your worship, what I'm kind of hearing and kind of piggybacking off Councillor Cherry and Councillor Palmer there is a little bit more targeted early engagement, because zoning bylaws are very different than an OCP. An OCP, you get so much of the community to come out to establish the vision at the beginning of the process. When we do a zoning bylaw, if you invite everyone to come out for a general open house to educate them on what a zoning bylaw is, they're going to be like, well, what are you changing and why are you inviting us out and why are you asking for feedback right now when you don't have anything that's drafted? So what I'm hearing is maybe a little bit more targeted early on engagement with members of the building community to just ask some general questions. What's working right now? What isn't working? And what are your thoughts on what's working well elsewhere, perhaps? And we do have meetings with the building community regularly. And so they're very aware that we are embarking on this process. So I'm sure that they would be very interested to share some insights at the onset of it.
Okay, awesome. That'd be great to include that.
Any further comments on engagement? So Mr. Simon can move on.
Just real quick, is there, with people, I see the potential for like this conflict. You know, especially like if you're zoned R1 and then all of a sudden your neighbor's gonna get like an R3 zoned lot. Is there any need to like do this in consultation with the attorneys and just make sure that we're, you know, covering all of our bases?
Comment, Mr. Simon.
Through your worship, we do legal review. And we've already, you know, kind of started down this road of what it looks like. And one of the questions here, and we'll delve into it, is pre-zoning of properties and also, you know, potentially down zoning of properties. We have a lot of large vacant single family lots. And what we heard really loud and clear with the OCP process was no more monster mansions on big lots to be developed and, you know, not the best use of land. So we are going to have to grapple with this concept of pre-zoning properties and what happens when you apply a new zone to a property that allows for maybe some additional development rights. But one of the biggest things to consider is, you know, whenever you're doing a zoning bylaw update, it's inevitable. You're going to have individuals that are coming out and they're going to be arguing for pre-zoning of their properties. And it's very important as staff's review and for council consideration that it can't be based on the individual wanting to pre-zone their property. It has to make good, logical sense from a planning and development perspective, whether or not that is supported. So it is something that we will need to grapple with. You are going to have people that are going to be coming out to advocate to increase their development rights. And that is certainly something that will need to be managed throughout the entire process.
Comment, follow-up, Councilor?
No follow-up, your worship. Thank you, Mr. Simon, for your presentation. Excellent as usual. And I'm in support of this. Thank you.
Right.
Oh, I got it.
Any other comments regarding engagement? Seeing none, let's carry on, Mr. Simon. Thank you.
So pre-zoning, moving on to the next big topic. So what pre-zoning is as we're doing this, again, you can think of it, we have a current zoning map. That whole zoning map is going to be thrown out the window, replaced with a new one, brand new zones that will be applied to all properties. Vast majority of properties, they might not see any noticeable difference, but we do have some large vacant properties that under the OCP are suitable for things like medium density, high density, or mixed use development. So this idea of, is council supportive of pre-zoning? And if so, are there certain things that staff need to consider with that? So obviously we wouldn't be recommending pre-zoning of any properties where it doesn't align with the OCP. It can help expedite things like housing projects because it negates the need to go through a rezoning process. However, some things for council to consider, when you pre-zone a property and you eliminate that rezoning step, we lose out on a legislated ability to enter into amenity negotiations with a proponent. And it also does reduce the public engagement process in a way that there's no automatic public hearing. And even under the new legislation where there's no default requirement for a public hearing, there is still notice that is provided for the bylaw. And council does get a lot of leeway to request additional information, do public information sessions when we are dealing with rezoning applications. So certainly items that need to be considered in whether or not we're going to pre-zone properties. So some of the questions we have is, in general, is council supportive of pre-zoning? And if so, are there certain neighborhoods where council views this appropriate? And are there certain things like city-owned lands? You know, maybe the comments are no pre-zoning of private properties, but city-owned lands that we want to prime for housing development. Let's pre-zone those properties so that we can get shovels in the ground faster. So just some items to consider, and know that this question will come up again when we bring a draft zoning map. And I want to make clear as well, any properties that are recommended for pre-zoning through our review will be noted for staff. These aren't going to be slipped in behind. We're not going to go from a property that would currently support 4 single-family residences to multi-story condos without having a robust discussion with council in the future. But just as a general starting point, you know, we wanted to take the temperature with council as to whether or not they're supportive of this tool to expedite development applications.
So I'm going to start, Mr. Simon. further to our conversation earlier today, when I was talking about the amenities where we can get developers to kind of do different things in our community, I'm supportive of things like city-owned lands for housing development, so that we know that we have control over some of that housing that's required in the community. Whereas we leave the private property when they come in to now say, okay, I want to take my single family lot and densify, because we know that's what you're asking for. We have the ability to ask for them to contribute in other ways to the community. So that's my sense of some of that stuff. So I'm just going to go around the table. Any other comments from councilors? Councilor Palmer?
Thank you, Mayor Souls. Yeah, it's an interesting, it's actually a pretty big question. And maybe it's too big of a question for us to entirely grapple with right now, and possibly either in a committee of the whole, maybe drilling into more detail some areas that the planning department sees as opportunities, bringing that back, and then we have maybe a bit more educated understanding of whether we are supportive or not. I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of, all of council here. So that's just a general statement. Then specifically for me, just on my own, I'd be very supportive of pre-zoning areas that protect that natural park. And so specifically areas like the Jordan River lands, and there's some other lands that we need to protect our natural amenities in the future. I think I alluded a little bit earlier to some of the other ones, but how that sort of relates to that whole discussion that you had, Mr. Simon, that's, I think needs to be brought in weight. And I think it's important for us to remember that if there's somebody that wants to rezone, they still have a right to put a rezoning application and just go through that process, and that leaves that opportunity for amenity contributions.
Okay, good. Thanks for that comment. Any other comments from council? Councilor Chair.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on this one, Your Worship. I'm also hugely supportive of pre-zoning public lands, especially when it comes down to the Roseville Community Housing Society or other future affordable housing projects. I'm also extremely hesitant about private lands at this time weighing in, as the implications are huge.
Comments noted. Thank you. Councilor Stephen.
I think to echo what Councilor Cherry has said, I think I'm hesitantly in favor of pre-zoning city-owned land, not knowing what the city owns currently. I think the key here is moving forward is to striving balance, being transparent, and making sure that everything is done in like a fairness and openness and in consideration of our neighbors.
Great. Any other comments from council? Councilor Orlando.
Yeah, Your Worship. In my view, I think the community needs to be aware of what that means. So there needs to be an education component before I would support that. And if they're aware of it, then they can also understand it a little bit better as to what's wrong.
Thanks for that comment. Councilor Devlin, any comment?
Just to echo what people said, with city-owned lands, not too unsupportive of that, but I don't know if I would go into it for privately owned lands too deeply. I'd rather keep the options for amenities and public involvement on the table rather than lose them because we pre-zone things.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Luciano, comment?
I would kind of just like to echo everybody else that pre-zoning for city-owned lands, I would be in support of, but not for privately owned properties.
Okay. So, Mr. Simon, does that give you enough information for the pre-zoning section at this point?
Through Your Worship, yes, it certainly does. And rest assured that, let's say, as we move forward and we do our initial release, and we get a whole block of a community that wants to see a certain parcel pre-zoned, that we're still open to bringing those conversations for council for future committee of the whole discussion at that time. So certainly opportunities for the community to provide that feedback.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, let's move on. Density.
Yeah, so generally just have a broad discussion on density, and think before we even get into a discussion about whether or not council generally supports the idea of increasing our baseline densities in areas where it makes sense. It's important to understand how density is calculated. So density can be something as simple as you can have one single family dwelling per lot. That's a measure of density. It can also be expressed in a units per hectare or units per acre measurement. So that's the average number of dwelling units that can be placed on a specified size of land. So for example, 30 dwelling units per hectare, that's currently our baseline density in the medium density zone, which for all intents and purposes is pretty low. And then lastly, it can be expressed as a measure of what we call floor area ratio, which is really common for multifamily and mixed use developments. That's what the vast majority of zoning bylaws are gearing towards right now, because it creates more flexibility. And what floor area ratio is you take the gross floor area of a building and you divide it by the size of the lot. And I got some diagrams here that would further illustrate this. So on the left side, you can see, and this is per acre, but it just gives you a general sense of, you know, we got 1 acre of land, you got 1 unit per acre. You got 1 acre of land, you got 6 units on there, you're at 6 units per acre, et cetera, as you go higher. On the right side, it gives you a general diagram of floor area ratio. So a good way to think about it, and just starting really simple, floor area ratio of 1, a lot where 100% of the lot is covered would be a 1-story building. You have the gross floor area of the building divided by the area of the lot. The building itself is 1 story, takes up the entire lot. That's a floor area ratio of 1. If that building takes up 50% of the lot, then it would be a 2-story building, 25% of the lot, 4-story building, etc. And one of the key reasons why planners are moving towards floor area ratio for multifamily and mixed use buildings is because it incentivizes more units on site and it incentivizes smaller units. When you have units per hectare, the number of units that you have that's permitted on a lot is fixed. So if you're only able to build, let's say 10 units on a lot where the density is regulated at 30 units per hectare, then you're going to want to build those units as big as possible and as luxurious as possible, which is what we're seeing with new development in the downtown core right now for some of the few mixed use and apartment buildings that we have had, where the units per hectare really does incentivize those bigger, more luxurious units, whereas we want to make sure that we're hitting all ends of the affordability spectrum on the market side. And when you move to floor area ratio, the number of units becomes irrelevant, but it really gets down to the size of the building with respect to the size of the lot and how that it's a lot easier to regulate those developments and how they fit within the context of a specific community. And that being said, when you have floor area ratio, you still have provisions that govern maximum lot coverage, maximum building heights, that you don't end up with some weird thing like they have in the diagrams on the bottom there that's more reminiscent of downtown Vancouver. So density is one of the big items that we need to review. And to be fully blunt, our baseline densities that have not been reviewed for decades within the downtown area, within our medium and high density zones, are far too low. From a general planning perspective, when we did the OCP, you know, one of the things that people said is, we don't want to see the community expand. We don't want to expand our boundaries. We want to work with what we have, which means we need to be creative and we need to utilize infill development. And for the few properties we have where it's what we refer to as greenfield development, you know, big piece of land that doesn't have much around it, we need to start looking at how do we incentivize and increase density rather than looking at low density development for the next 20 years and then having to expand our boundaries as our population increases. So understanding whether there's a general support for increased density, again, a lot of caveats, where and how much, big questions. So some things to consider, you know, number of stories, gentle densification in single detached areas, you know, for example, then Arrow Heights, you know, is council supportive of seeing things like small blocks of row houses potentially to start to diversify the housing supply. These are all things that we can use to draft standardized zones that make it that much easier for someone to go through a rezoning process. So some of the big questions are, you know, generally speaking, is council supportive of increased density? Are there areas where council thinks it's appropriate to, you know, see increased density? Downtown, Victoria Road, And lastly, this idea of gentle densification, a lot of different ways you can do it, but certainly something that's going to come up as part of the zoning bylaw review. Could include things like on larger lots, instead of being restricted to a house with a suite, you might be able to have a house with a suite and a garden suite on it. So I'll pass it back to you, Your Worship, and just again, high level general sense if council's comfortable with seeing increased density.
Okay, any comments from council? I think, from my perspective, higher density is what we need to home the people in our community. And being able to utilize some of these bigger lots, whether it's a smaller house, a higher house, having a suite, have a garden suite, those sorts of things. I like this floor area ratio sort of thing as well. Seems to be the way to go forward, but the ability to allow for smaller lots, increased density is really probably what's going to sway things as far as we're able to at least accommodate more people in our community. So I'm going to go around the table. Councillor Stakenhurst, you have your hand up.
I'm just going to echo exactly what you said. I think this is exactly the solution. Like when we look at the housing crisis, when we look at the demand of housing, I think this is one of the easiest things that we can do in regards to getting more housing on the market is to change our current zoning bylaws. I think this is exactly what we need in order to help support the community grow in a manner that's responsible and calculated. So I'm totally in favor of this. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Cherry, then Councillor Paul.
Yeah, it's no shock that we're in a bit of a housing crisis, but we're also in an affordability crisis, both for our current housing stock as well as our rentals. I'm quite supportive of this. I'd like to see it go one step further and we start having conversations about potentially eliminating the R1 zone completely, allowing carriage suites and secondary suites in R2 and other zones as well.
Okay. So, Councillor Luciano, you turned your camera on. You have a comment?
Yeah, no, I am definitely in support of density kind of across the board. Right now, I don't see any areas where we shouldn't be increasing density. I feel there is the scale of how dense we can allow some developments in certain areas, but I don't think there should be any areas that should not see increased density.
Great, thank you. Any other comments, Councillor Orlando?
Your Worship, sort of in my view, this has been getting to the zoning bylaw, getting to increasing density has been sort of an objective of council for, close to a decade now, and we're trying to get there, and we're just at that stage right now. So I don't feel this is a new discussion. I think it's just we're in the steps of that procedure where we're doing the zoning bylaw now to get there. So yeah, it's good to see us moving forward and taking concrete steps.
Okay. Any other comments, Councillor Palmer?
Thank you, Mayor Souls. Through to Mr. Simon. Is he there?
Yeah, Mr. Simon's still here.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Good. Can't see you. I'm in favor of densification, but not at the expense of destruction of natural amenities, viewscapes, green spaces. And so there's a little piece in here, and it's allowing even more height in order to protect green spaces. So in general, some of the developments, the row houses that we've had, before us in the last several months, year or so, the traditional townhouse, the Surrey feel, if you wish, I think it's a missed opportunity that we could have that same kind of densification or even higher densification by allowing height. And so there's areas that are going to be developed up in Arrow Heights, perhaps where the old gun range was, and other industrial developments that by going up higher would allow protecting the viewscapes, allow much higher density, but still protecting green spaces rather than just having this sort of big city subdivision, multiple row houses. So that bulk massing And so even in downtown, you know, there was a missed opportunity across the street here. Could have had it a bit narrower, a bit better viewscapes, higher density without having a major impact. You know, use base camp. Another example is on Highway 23. That could have been much higher value for the developer and allowed for a higher densification. So I want to make sure that we're not just saying density at the expense of what our natural amenities and what Revelstoke really is. And it gets to that whole idea of eco-density opportunities.
Great, well, I appreciate that comment. Mr. Simon has noted that. Councillor Stapleton.
Just to Councillor Palmer's point of increasing in height, from my experience working in the fire service, the height of the building becomes an issue because now you've increased the resources needed to mitigate incidents within those. So there's a balance there, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration when looking at the height of the buildings.
Yeah, so they agree, and I think Mr. Black's nodding his head as well. So I think that's good. All right, any other comments on densification? Seeing none, we'll leave those with you, Mr. Simon. Let's move on. We just have a couple other things to deal with.
Thank you. Yes, only two more, and these ones should be easy. So we're almost through it. So parking, it's another big topic. You know, the city recently did the OCP, the engineering department's doing a great job working on the transportation master plan. We have a lot of documents that are talking about this shift away from vehicular transportation as the primary mode of getting people around. And especially as a resort community, people come here, you know, we don't want to see just seas of parking lots 30 years from now that aren't going to be used. So we got to start thinking about what should our parking requirements be and how do you start to have innovative requirements without it being at the expense of massive challenges with on-street parking. So some things to consider with this, you know, parking requirements, they have a direct impact on the highest and best use of land. When you have excessive parking requirements, you're going to end up with less units on a lot. That's just the reality. When you start having excessive requirements for parking to be required underground, you're looking at, you know, 60 to 80 grand is probably an undershot. You're looking really 80 to 100 grand for underground parking per stall. So we've got to be cognizant of how these requirements for parking ultimately influence affordability in the community as well. So we just want to understand at this time, generally speaking, if council wants to, you know, see changes in the parking regulations to support reductions, and these reductions would be supported when they are done in a way that enables and promotes active transportation is how the planning group envisions it. And then in addition to, and it's a bit more of a pointed question, but we have secondary suites, garden suites, and carriage suites, and we have lots of properties in town where their biggest challenge is they can't meet the parking requirement. Right now you need one per stall. So just another thing to try and get the gears turning for council. Are you guys supportive, or what are the thoughts around should there be parking requirements for what we refer to as accessory dwelling units to try and help with that gentle densification? Parking is always a constraint that comes to mind. So I will pass it off to council for conversation on this.
Anyone want to lead this off? Councillor Lano?
Your worship, I would like to, but unfortunately I need to leave.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Thank you.
So Mr. Simon, I'd like to weigh in just a little bit with parking, and so even in my neighborhood, I'm seeing carriage houses being built in the backyards, and they have room for one vehicle with that, and the main house may not now have any more driveway, or may have room for one. And then other cars are remaining on the street. I don't see that as an issue as long as there's, a way to work around that for snow removal. And everybody who lives in Revelstoke has figured out a way to work around that for snow removal. So you go down some of the collector streets, we can go down 2nd, 3rd, 4th. And when the graders come and they're hopping their cars around the corner to make sure that the area in front of their homes is being taken care of, or they're not, and then there becomes an issue. But I think the less we get involved with demanding, one spot for every house or 2 spots or whatever the case may be, We're now giving that ability to do the densification. We're talking about active transportation, getting people onto our transit system, riding bicycles, that sort of thing. That's all part of that transportation plan. So to muffle that plan by saying, you know, you need to have room for all these cars, you know, I'll be one of the first to admit, I like cars. And so I have some people in the community going like, why do you have so many cars? And going, well, that's my choice. I don't drive them all at the same time. But I have room on my lot for my vehicle. So I look at that and go, I've built according to my plan, but the ability to build, had we had what we're doing now back in the early 2000s when I renovated, I probably would have put in a garden suite. We would have gone higher. We would have done different things. And you look at that and go, okay, is it cost prohibitive for me to do that now? Probably. But, you know, whatever we can do to initiate getting cars off of the streets and allowing people to build is really, in my mind, how we need to go. So I'll go around the council table. Any comments on Councilor Stapenhurst?
I'd like to just say that in my experience living in both Washington, D.C. and living in Ottawa, you know, the trail networks in those two cities are memorable, right? And the parking was horrendous. And that's just the nature of the beast. You know, and I think we have an opportunity here with the master transportation plan to implement, you know, a pathway system or sidewalk system, some alternative methods of transportation that, you know, would set us apart from all the other communities in BC. I think that if you look at communities like such as Whistler, they've got a great trail network system. I think the parking requirement, I think it's you know, everybody here arrives in a car. And it's unfortunate, but I think by requiring a parking criteria, I think it's you know, we're trying to be proactive in housing. I think by enforcing parking regulations, I think we're counteracting what we're doing. So I think I'm not in favor of parking regulations. I think you know, most people, you know, those of us that have lived in big cities, we're used to, you know, having to park on the streets, having a parallel park. You know, sometimes parking blocks away from your residence. I mean, it's the unfortunate reality when you come to, you know, development.
Okay. Councilor Chair.
I think that as a council, we need to have a serious discussion on what we want to address. We all know we're in a housing crisis. Do we want to add housing stock, knowing that by minimizing some of the parking requirements, we're going to be able to do that? Personally, I do. I think that's the best way to solve some of our issues, especially with the transportation master plan that will hopefully be saying soon. Also want to remind council that we've only been doing this for a few months now, and we've lost out on 65 units of secondary suites in our short time here just because of parking requirements and the costs around those. Anecdotally, I own a bunch of properties in town. I can't increase the density because of the parking requirements. I'm not going to spend 50 grand or $46,000 for 2 parking spots that don't fit on my property to build a carriage suite. It's not a cost-effective way to tackle our housing situation.
And, you know, good point. And I know that just sitting around this table for the past several years, there's been, with our regulations and trying to follow those regulations, we've lost opportunities. And so I look at this and go, I think we need to, you know, get rid of the parking regulations, at least the way they are now, and allow us to go forward. We talk about the densification. We want to do that. We talk about greening our community. This has been something around this table has been very, very clear. Do we want more bicycles in the community? Do we want that sort of thing? Absolutely. We'll look at that sort of thing. So I think, you know, getting away from this. Councilor Palmer.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Simon. I'm going to make a tongue-in-cheek comment to start with. So as we reduce the parking requirements, which there seems to be a strong sentiment, which I also agree with, then maybe we'll have to increase our bylaw budget and maybe buy a tow truck for the city so we can take all, you know, as a result of the development, all these people parking on the street, and creating another problem. My
Can
point.
you drive a tow truck?
Sorry,
Can you drive a tow truck?
I could try.
There we go.
But you can. Yeah, it's got a-
Jim can, okay, there, we
So-
got, okay, let's carry on.
So my point is that new development does need to address the parking issues that they create.
Right.
And so, just diving a little bit deeper on the discussion that we've had here already is how can we, through the zoning and other tools, ensure that there's more ability for reducing the parking requirement? And so the lost opportunity, we're talking about lost opportunities like in Mackenzie Village on multi-use paths that integrate into a larger spine in our master transportation plan that we'll soon be adopting. Other tools when we look at the future, is there means to require bigger developments, even some of the ones that have just been before us recently, of requiring car share in order to reduce the demand. So as we design around people instead of designing around cars, how can we make this happen? And so I'd like to see how those tools and modernization and how we can be creative. There is another important thing that we talk about: affordability and poverty reduction and that kind of thing. And transportation cost is a major component. And so how can we reduce the reliance on vehicles and have better mechanisms? And certainly when we look at other tools, it's outside the zoning, but things like our empty bus, it does not serve us well. And we have to rethink on how we're doing that. It's not a matter of just expanding the services. Rethink how we're providing transportation, especially for those that are on limited income, so that we no longer have to have these extra vehicles that are, in the town, all the cars are parked, just like on your slide right there. All the cars in Revelstoke are parked, and it's it's all this inventory that's unnecessary. So how do we change that whole mentality? And then we can reduce the parking requirements by making it much more livable in Revelstoke. So I really look forward to seeing how you can be creative with those components.
Councillor Lucien, your comment?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Schulz. I would be wary of eliminating parking requirements. I think it's something that we have to advance with slowly. I would look for parking requirements for short-term rentals, because those people will be coming into town in vehicles and they'll need somewhere to put their vehicles that isn't on our roadways, especially going into the winter seasons. And I would also look to see if we could put in a opt-out fee for parking requirements that would go towards building and maintaining multi-use pathways, just in support of building our master transportation plan and the network that we have around town.
Great, thank you for that comment. Councillor Devlin?
I don't see any reason why reducing parking requirements wouldn't benefit us in terms of densification and housing, which is kind of the big target that we've all been talking about. Well, not just us, everybody in town has been talking about for 10 years. So it seems to be a direct correlation between reducing or eliminating. I will leave that up to the staff's best discretion. But in general, reducing parking requirements seems to be on the path to increasing affordability and increasing housing. So I'm all supportive of that.
Great, thanks for that. I give you enough information, Mr. Simon?
To your worship, yes, and really exciting, actually. The province changed legislation not too far back that when you're paying cash in lieu for parking, and right now our rates are really high, and the OCP says we need to revisit those. But instead of it having to go towards vehicular parking infrastructure, there is the ability to redirect it for active transportation infrastructure. So to Councillor Lucio and Councillor Palmer's points, we're going to be looking at all the options that we can be innovative with our parking requirements to incentivize the shift to multimodal transportation. So certainly some tools out there that we're excited to explore.
Perfect, good. What I want to see is us being able to drive our golf carts that I don't have yet on the roads, right?
Like dirt bikes.
There we go. Awesome. All right, we're getting down that rabbit hole that I didn't want to get into, and I'm starting it. Let's move on to animal agriculture, Mr. Simon.
Through your worship, thank you. This is the last question we have for council today, so I appreciate you guys bearing with us through this presentation. So right now, animal agriculture, it's a big thing. It's called for in the OCP and one of the action items. And I'm sure that everyone at the table is aware there's been a push from certain segments of the community to explore urban animal agriculture. So right now, the zoning bylaw, it allows for crop production in all zones, but the only form of animal agriculture is hen keeping. That's when it's ancillary to a residential use. So it can be an important part of sustainability, but can also pose implications in urban areas. So odor, pests, diseases, that's all considerations that we need to have with animal agriculture. So again, just real high level, we understand that there's certainly more supplementary regulations that would need to be developed to guide how, when, where animal agriculture is appropriate within the city. But just in general, is this something that council is supportive of staff doing further research on to ultimately bring forward some amendments that in staff's review and in consultation with the community, we feel could be workable for the city of Revelstoke?
Any comments from councillors regarding, different kinds of animals on property in different areas? So, I'll go back to not that many years ago, where even our neighborhood, some of the bigger lots, even in some of my family, had different kinds of animals raised for food, and they cared for them on their property. They had the proper building to house them in, whatever that case may be. And I look at that and go, it wasn't a problem for the community at that time. I'm not sure what that would be like or what it would look like nowadays, but that's just comment. So any comment from any of you? Councillor Lucero, any comments regarding
Thanks, Marshall.
These are goat.
Yeah, like obviously, food security is a huge issue for the community, as well as something that I'm kind of involved in on a day-to-day basis. So I would look for staff to come forward with future provisions for animal agriculture and just more information about that, as well as opening it up to different kinds of livestock that could be on properties.
Any other comments?
Yeah, generally in supportive of the idea. It's hard to be supportive of specific things because this is a very general idea, but like you were saying, I grew up on my grandfather's farm, so I mean, definitely used to having animals around in residential areas, but I mean, it's a different world we live in now, so it's not or anything. But generally, yeah, I'd be willing to look at it. So it needs a lot more work, but if Mr. Simon and his team want to go down that road, I'd be supportive of that.
Councillor Palmer,
yeah, so I'm going to start with a tongue-in-cheek comment again. It has a purpose to make a point. So I would be in favor of allowing horses in R1 zones, all R1 zones, so that people can ride their horses into town along our multi-use paths. The point that I really want to make is I think we need to go down this road carefully because we're talking about densification, smaller lots, neighbor conflicts.
Right.
And there's reasons, way back in the 1950s when they didn't, stop having pigs and stuff like that in residential or in cities, basically. So as we go down there, yes, there's the food security, but where do goats and pigs belong? So I support it philosophically of that whole idea, but then there's this practicality, and I think we need to be cautious.
Absolutely, and I'll make the statement that it was kind of common. We didn't have problems with chickens until we brought in a bylaw.
Exactly.
Right.
I fully support a city-owned goat herd to cut our grasses.
Mr. Black, do you have any goat herders in your crew?
We'll get them.
Greenhouse gases, no more fuel, no more carburetor issues. It's a win-win.
Quickly learn that.
Depends how many goats you need. Yeah, depends how many goats you need.
We could rent them out, put them down.
They produce a lot of greenhouse gases.
Councillor Cherry, any comment?
Yeah, I'm hesitantly supportive of what's been presented here. I echo all the grand issues you have. I mean, grew up on a farm, lived on a farm for years, family still owns a farm. All the things listed here are all issues. with living next to a farm. This is a city.
And, well, and thanks for that. Thank you all for your comments, because I think, you know, Mr. Simon, when we start talking about animal agriculture, what's, you know, we're going to look to you and say, what's being done in comparative communities that's working? Because from my perspective, I made that kind of tongue-in-cheek comment about chickens, but the reality was people had chickens before and nobody said anything, or, you know, it was just part of life. We bring in a bylaw and you know, we're having issues with that. So I think council's supportive of you coming back with something saying this would work or wouldn't work, and we go from there.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I do just want to note that we would be reaching out and working with the food sustainability coordinator, Melissa Hemphill, who I know is pretty keen on this topic as well.
All right, let's move on. Thank you.
So that's it for me. I got an overview of next steps, but before we finish on that note, just want to make sure, is there anything that council feels was missed in the presentation? Any really pressing items that you want us to know right off the bat before we start delving into this big zoning bylaw project?
Councilor Lusso?
Thank you, Mayor Schulz. I think the only thing I'd like to bring up is just the protection for mobile trailer parks. They do offer a great option for below market housing, which a lot of people are in right now. And I just want to make sure that they aren't forgotten about through this zoning rewrite.
So I just on that note, I think that what you will see at the conclusion, I can't predict the future, but we have a specific zoning for mobile home parks. And I think that that zoning will be examined in light of how do we allow for, you know, potential better use of the land with more mobile home parks on there, rather than, you know, within reason, of course, but rather than pre-zoning those properties to allow for future redevelopment, because that is, it will be a separate project, having a mobile home park redevelopment policy come forward for council. And I don't think that you're going to see recommendations from staff to pre-zone existing mobile home parks, because they are so critical to providing affordable housing in the community right now.
Thank you very much.
Any other comments from council? Seeing none, let's go on to next steps.
So just very briefly, staff will take the feedback from council. Thank you very much for bearing with me through this. I know it's a long conversation, but it's really important. And I think getting this out right at the beginning gives staff great direction to, you know, hit the ground running with this project. So we'll go back, look at our project management plan, make some tweaks and changes specifically on that public engagement strategy based on the feedback from council today. You can expect a launch of this sometime in March on Talk Revelstoke. And then we're going to get right to it with engagement with the APC come March. So that's it for next steps, and no more talking from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Simon. I appreciate your input and your presentation. Much appreciated. Okay, we're going to move on to Parks Recreation Cape Application year-end update. And so I cannot see. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Good. Ms. Donato, do you have a bit of a presentation or comments? Can't hear you. Nope. Your headset's not lit up. Maybe it's dead. Can't hear you.
Sounded doesn't look packed. Or the hot tub.
Just yell really loud.
Oh, it's loud.
She has the best view in town. I want to be in that pool, right?
Or the worst.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, I never thought about that.
Note to self for the next committee of the whole.
Now you're muted. Unmute. Try it.
Just don't want to unmute him.
Can you unmute?
No.
At least it was a short meeting.
Doesn't want to stay unmuted.
This
could
was
do
gonna
this
be the
later.
quickest presentation of the
We
day.
could do this later. It's not super crucial anyway. Why don't we do this next? Give me the whole stuff on
Do you want to send her a text?
Maybe she'll just run over.
It's not super, it's not time sensitive or anything.
No. We
It's just
have
an update.
quarterly reports, so we can ask her about that stuff.
She could probably hear you if we.
Mr. Nana, can you hear me?
Charades, let's go.
No.
Oh, no, she doesn't have her headset on now.
Draw a picture.
She's looking at her phone.
Is she? It's in your team's message too.
Sending you a message. Meet you at the Village Idiot in 5.
While you're, doing your talking.
She does not have a presentation.
Okay, good. All right, then we're not gonna, so any comments about, if you, Mr. Black, is there something you need to talk?
No.
You were just gonna fill a dead
Just
air?
gonna fill some.
Okay, so just seeing, the committee for public events, some of the things that are coming up, I have no issue with it. She looks after that, that committee looks after that. Councillor Devlin, do you sit on that committee?
I do sit on that committee.
Any comments that you'd like to make?
Nope, the only thing that we have, I think this is, these are all 2022,
Okay.
the only upcoming thing is the
Oh, yeah.
RCMP versus Fire on hockey game, which
Saturday, tomorrow.
Yeah. that's all that's been on the agenda thus far, other than us talking about, the things we talked about last week.
Last game?
All right.
I don't know.
Good. Council Palmer?
I just proved whether or not it was happening. I didn't get a schedule. They don't give you an agenda.
Just comments. Thank you to the director on the report. Well done, and thanks for the information.
No, great, good. Same thing with the quarterly report. I appreciate the information. We can go through that and see if there's any concerns, but basically she's just stating the stats and I appreciate the way that that Mr. Nalla runs her department. Awesome. All right, any more comments from council? Seeing none, I'm going to ask for a motion to go in camera pursuant to section 90.1A and E and D of the community charter. Someone want to make that motion for me? Councillor Stapenhurst, seconded by Councillor Cherry. All in favor? Motion's carried. We'll take a couple minute break and then we will go in camera.